voice sounded in the shroud of rain. "Is it you who ordered the taxi? Run quickly." I opened the door. "Thanks," Travis echoed and darted under the wall of solid downpour in search of a car. "From a business trip to Kansas? Only the regional ones come into the bus station at this hour," the cabbie merrily mouthed. "My name is John." Travis, the passenger, introduced himself. "Yeah, from a business trip. It just so happens." "And what do you do?" the chauffeur inquired. "Buying and selling," Travis smiled. "I have enough with my wife and mother. Doing pretty good. I'm working. Sometimes I have to go on business trips." "I dream of starting my own business too," John smiled, "to make furniture. But there you need machines and startup capital. So that's what I'm doing for now. But in general, I'm a carpenter by vocation." "Yeah, that's what you all say," Travis smiled, not realizing he'd hit a nerve. "You're probably not the biggest businessman either. If you don't drive your fancy car back, you take a taxi." Travis gave the driver a disgruntled look. They drove the rest of the way in silence. He didn't leave a tip for the driver. Let him talk less on the road. Travis kept glancing at his watch, knowing that his mother was visiting. She'd said it was Mrs. Annie's anniversary, and her wife was still working. There was no one at home. Letting the taxi go, he rushed into the house. It was a good brick cottage in a nice village with a large plot of land. Travis had bought it with his first earnings and put it in his mother's name so that his wife could not claim the property in a divorce. Nervously looking around, he walked straight into the living room without taking off his shoes and pressed the secret tab on the chair. There was a click, and a spring lifted the wooden bar. But instead of the expected amount of money, the stash was empty. There was nothing there. Travis absent-mindedly rechecked the stash, even stuck his hand inside. Then he cursed, sat back in his chair, and put his head down on his hands. He was in serious trouble. He didn't want to go on this business trip at all. The night before, he'd had bad dreams. While packing, he shoved his passport and driving license somewhere, but he still went. And there, in a neighboring region, he got caught up in a hit and run. He was very technically bypassed, squeezed between cars. And when Travis started thrashing about on the road, they simply set up the bumper of an expensive luxury car. Yeah, the boot alone was worth as much as his Chinese car. He understood. Didn't even offer to call a traffic cop. He just stood there and listened like he was dreaming. "That's what you're in for." "Man," the short man in the Cadillac in front of him said with a chuckle, "your junk won't compensate me much, of course, but right now sign the car over to me and write a receipt, a promissory note." And if I don't?" Travis asked, looking around. "They'd picked a blind spot for the accident. Then the meter will start ticking, and then you'll owe us something else." "Jasper, the guy's alive. Thanks. Might be all right, you'll get off easy." "Okay, let me sign it," Travis said. "There's nothing to do anyway." "That's right. We'll give you a lift into town." The short guy grinned. "We'll do a good deed." They did give him a ride. They stopped by the notary's office. Travis was already signing everything they gave him, just as long as it was over soon. Then he read the paperwork at the hotel, and his head snapped up. He'd just lost his favorite car, and he was in huge debt. There was only one small chance to make things right. But to do that, he had to go home. Travis sighed and started looking for a bus ticket to his hometown on the internet. He was counting on the help of his mistress's father, a criminal mastermind. In criminal circles, everyone called him Chief by sight, but in person they respectfully referred to him as Mr. Alex. This puny man seemed simple, but only until he was confronted by people who had the same interests. Travis had known Marion for about a year. She had been having an uncomplicated affair with him, begging for more and more expensive gifts. Without gifts, he had no reason to visit her. And if Travis was going to ask her father for help, he had to be prepared. That was why he'd relied so much on his stash in the armrest of the chair, a stash of cash that no one in the house knew about. At least, that's what he'd thought until that day. But now it appeared that he had been outfoxed, his money taken. Feeling a surge of rage, he sat down in a chair and waited for his wife to come home from work. Amanda, unsuspecting of the stash, was carrying a heavy bag of groceries. She planned to prepare his favorite stuffed cabbage for her husband's return from a business trip. Balancing her umbrella and bag with difficulty, she opened the door and saw her husband's shoes in the hallway. "Travis, are you home already?" she shouted cheerfully. "I'll get dinner ready in a minute." "What are you doing home so early?" "It just happened," Travis replied, barely containing his anger. "What are you doing home from work so late?" "I was just getting some kale. I didn't like it at one shop, but I'm still picking it out at the second shop. I'll make stuffed cabbage for tonight. Or are you very hungry? Maybe I should boil some homemade dumplings for now." "Let's have dumplings," nodded Travis. "Why, have you had your wages this month yet?" "Not until a couple of days ago." Amanda wondered, "Why are you suddenly interested?" "Well, just keeping the conversation going. Look, is that what you're doing in your sporting goods? You should be selling fat suits. Don't they look at the appearance of the salespeople there?" "Oh, Travis, I'm a former professional swimmer. Don't forget," she grinned. "And I know better about sports equipment than a lot of amateurs. As in real training, not these guru complexes that help you lose weight in 5 days. That's why my management appreciates me and gives me bonuses. And about my shape now, do you need to tell? It is after 4 unsuccessful attempts in hormone therapy. Weight has added, and now know where it goes away. It's not my fault. 4 years, a lot of money thrown away, and still no kids," Travis said resentfully. "I mean, I warned you about infertility right away," she retorted. "You didn't care about it then." "Well, yeah, right. I mean, I married a champion and got a domestic wreck. By the way, did you move the chair in the living room? It doesn't look right." "That one seems to be in place." Amanda threw a glance at the living room. "What's wrong with it? Are you leveling it on a ruler or something?" "I left something in the chair. I can't find it now," the spouse replied. "Well, ask the cleaning lady. She came yesterday," she replied indifferently. "Maybe you saw your super valuable item. I didn't personally take anything." Travis watched his wife's reaction to his words carefully. But Amanda, if she was the one who had taken the money from the stash, didn't give anything away, though it was always hard to tell with her. Athletes are unusual people, and she also grew up in an orphanage with living parents. She didn't keep in touch with her family and generally preferred to keep quiet unless asked. The door slammed, interrupting Travis's musings. Mom had come home. Mrs. Emily was glad to see her son back, and her friend's birthday had ended early, and her soul was in need of a celebration. So she proposed to celebrate the meeting. "Come on, son. Let's have a little drink. It's been a long time since we talked, all together in a family circle." "Yes, Mom, of course," Travis replied, taking out a decanter and shot glasses from the bar. He poured the hot stuff, and Amanda hurried to serve steaming homemade dumplings and sauces. She cooked willingly, having learned everything after her marriage, and it was delicious. Even her mother-in-law, who disliked Amanda a little, considering her a simple-minded sportswoman, appreciated her cooking. And on the whole, Mrs. Emily wasn't too hard on her daughter-in-law. She brought up her son alone, knew that he had outbursts of anger, and Travis was not known for his faithfulness to his partners. Amanda was a good wife. After a drink, Travis' tongue was loose, and he began to talk, gradually getting himself worked up and setting himself up for a scandal. Seeing the first signs of his irritation, Mrs. Emily tensed. She was well acquainted with such behavior. Her ex-husband, Travis's father, had behaved the same way. Mrs. Emily had once run away from him with only a suitcase and a small son. Now she tried to nip the conflict in the bud. "Travis, tell me, how was your trip?" "Bad," he suddenly yelled, "and some rat took money out of my stash." "Well, confess, did you take it?" "No. I don't know anything about your stash at all," replied Amanda, to whom the words were addressed. "Come on, we'll get some sleep. You don't seem to be able to drink at all." "No way. Give me my money," yelled the husband, clenching his fists, decided to rob me and get away with it. "Now you're going to go and charge me all the money on your card." "Are you crazy?" "I've never had such sums at home before." His wife threw back at him and got up from the table. She wanted to burst into tears, but she had to hold back her tears. She would not cry in front of her husband and mother-in-law. She quickly packed her bag, a skill they had learned at the sports boarding school for years. Then she threw on her jacket and hailed a taxi. She drove to Linda's house, the one she'd been at boarding school with. Travis sat at the table across from his mother and continued to drink. Mrs. Emily was already scaring Travis, but she was gently trying to steer him into thinking that Amanda was not to blame for what had happened. Son, but think about it. Where would she get any money to look for? And she's not that bright. There's a hiding place, her mother persuaded her. I agree, she's simple-minded. But then who took it? The cleaning lady? She seems to be a checked aunt. Many years with us. No, she couldn't, Mrs. Emily nodded. But they came to check the pipes. Just yesterday, 2 men were going round everyone's rooms and down into the cellar. Could it be them? You should know that you can't find a hiding place in an armchair so easily. The thing is ancient, unique. I found out about this secret myself by accident. There's just people here for the first time in the house. Travis realized, tired, and finally drifted off to sleep. His mother's version of extraneous kidnappers didn't convince him much. Mrs. Emily listened anxiously to the receding footsteps and thought of the bizarre coincidence that she would not have gone into her son's hiding place. It was a last resort. Mrs. Emily knew of its existence, of course. She was the one who collected antiques and was quite good at it. The plan was to get the money she needed by selling the jewelry. But her trusted fence was out of town for a month. She didn't want to get in touch with random people, and money for expensive paid medical research was urgently needed. So she crawled into the stash, planning to get it all back by the time Travis returned. Except her son arrived too soon. Before she could put the stash back where it belonged, her innocent daughter-in-law was caught in the act. While Mrs. Emily was wallowing in regret, Amanda had already reached Linda's friend's house. She called from the taxi, who offered to stay with her for the time being. As she packed her things, Amanda told her what had happened. I've been saying for a long time, your husband is weird. Linda grinned. He's got a stash of money. He'd kill himself for a penny, and this is a fortune. I don't know. It's a lot of money to me, too, she replied. All right. I'll have to think about whether I should go back to him. We've got redundancies at work, too. Chain shops are closing. Optimization. Last week of work, and that's it. Listen, I just saw a job advert on social media. Some new firm. Linda furrowed her brow. It says a lot of people are needed, and the terms are kind of simple. You know, nothing complicated. They even take people with no experience. I'll find it. Where is it? See how things are working out for you. A new life, a job. Look, by the way, the salary is 3 times what you're making now. Must be a firm in the capital, so they pay well. Not like our cheapskates. Yeah, probably, Amanda replied absent-mindedly. Thanks. I'll be sure to call tomorrow to see what's what. Amanda said enthusiastically. You know, I felt a rush of energy. I guess it really is a chance to turn things around. She fell asleep in her new place and thought about how strange life was. She was born into a complete family. Her father and mother were staunch advocates of a healthy lifestyle, and they also had children all the time. Amanda, the oldest, lost count at about the 7th. There were tiered beds everywhere in their 1-bedroom flat. Nappies were drying, and as the eldest, she looked after the babies. The only escape from this duty for her was school. And when they announced that they would be taking them to swimming lessons after school, the girl was just happy. And the coach saw something in this scowling teenage girl. Amanda moved to the boarding school of the Olympic Reserve School, and for the first time found herself in a room with her own bed and bedside table. She competed a lot, won medals, received prize money. But she couldn't take adult competitions anymore. Her kidneys were affected. Something on the female line, complications started. Then I had an operation and the doctor's verdict, infertility for life. At 19, such a diagnosis did not seem a disaster. However, Amanda cried all night after it. Then she wiped her tears and moved into a rented flat. She got a job at a sporting goods shop and met Travis. He recognized her immediately. He was surprised that such a famous athlete works behind the counter. They got to talking, went on a couple of dates, and he proposed. She moved out of the rented flat and into her husband's house. Her mother-in-law didn't like her much, but they managed to avoid open conflicts. But Travis wanted children, Without them, he considered the family incomplete. Reluctantly, Amanda agreed to try an artificial method, and their torment began. Years of hormone therapy, unsuccessful attempts to get pregnant. After each of them, she gained exactly 5 kilos and joked that it was just swelling from tears. And there were a lot of them. After her 4th failed IVF, Amanda refused to try again. Now, when she wanted to become a mom so badly, it was impossible. She withdrew into herself, focusing even more on life and domesticity. And where did that lead? With these thoughts, she fell asleep. Travis got up the next morning with a headache. He almost regretted his angry outburst last night, and even accepted the loss of the money. But as soon as he switched on his dead phone to charge it, he was flooded with calls and texts reminding him how much he owed. Travis sent a short reply saying he was looking for money. He was once again reminded of the deadline and that interest was rising, but was not bothered again that day. Angry again, Travis shaved, dressed, and left the house, hailing a taxi to Marion's house. The mistress was waiting for her hapless beau, but she expected gifts, not empty hands. Travis's visit had disappointed her, and his request had enraged her. "Not only did you not give me that bracelet you promised, but you're asking me to set you up with your father," she resented him. "Isn't there anything else to do? Shine your shoes, perhaps?" "Marion, darling, you understand," Travis pleaded. "So next time there'll be a ring or a brooch to go with the bracelet. Do you know how many of those askers come to me every day?" She grinned. "And what makes you better than the others?" "I'm ready to ask you to marry me. Well, when I divorce mine, of course," Travis promised. "Okay, I'll talk to my father," replied a satisfied Marion. "But I'm not promising anything." "Okay, you just get him to meet with me. I'll take it from there," he replied. And while her son swore to his mistress in eternal love, Mrs. Emily sat at the reception of the capital's medical luminary. She got to him for a consultation for a lot of money, and even urgently took tests for a fee. Now the doctor looked at them and squinted meaningfully. "Well, my dear, you have a malignant tumor, metastasis. The stage is neglected, of course. As a matter of fact, you understand everything yourself. Any doctor in the district dispensary would tell you that." "I wanted a second opinion," said Mrs. Emily tearfully. "Well, you've got one, but you haven't got the money. You could have saved money," the doctor sighed. "We're not gods, you know, if even to operate, and I think that the time is lost. There's very little chance." "Thank you for your honesty," Mrs. Emily replied, and walked out of the office. What she had been shaking her hands for and pulling the money out of her son's stash had turned out to be nothing. The woman had hoped that the paid examination would give a different result, and the tumor would turn out to be a mistake, a terrible accident. But now she had to live with the realization that it was forever, and she had very little time left. While his mother learned her diagnosis, Travis stayed with his mistress. She had already called his father, who was ready to receive Travis at his country house. They drove there in Marion's car. The girl was surprised but did not show it. In the country house, she took him to her father and disappeared into the corridors. The house was large, a real mansion. Travis looked around and dreamed of marrying his mistress. Marion's father received him quite warmly, listened to him, and said, "Shall we fix your case? I'll make inquiries, of course, but it's clear enough. It's the little fellow that's stirring up the water. We'll sort it out, kid, don't worry. You'll have to pay me back, though. How'll you manage?" "How much do you want?" Travis asked in a gray voice, feeling a chill run down his spine. "Nothing at all. As a future relative to come into your business, giving me a small share." "Well, sure," Travis cheered. "Yes, with a future father-in-law, I'm ready to run the business together." "Good. Deal. Consider your problems gone. We'll settle everything now, and only this. Let's rewrite everything at once. We'll call a notary, your lawyer and mine." "Sure, okay." Travis felt almost euphoric at how easily his problem had been solved. "In fact, son, stay with me for a while. It's not like anyone's waiting for you at home." "Oh no, not at all. I'd love to. And Marion." "Well, how can I do without her?" grinned the husky man. "Go ahead, call and have your papers ready. And then, of course." "But it'll take a couple of days for sure," Travis warned. Are we in a hurry or what? Mr. Will grinned. Oh, that's all right. This is home for you now. Travis, the safest place for you to be. You just sit there. Keep your head down while the big uncles take care of your problems. Amanda had learnt over the phone that morning that all the shop's employees had already been retroactively dismissed. They'd been paid and didn't have to go to work. So she called the phone number Linda had given her. It turned out that recruitment was already in full swing, and she should hurry to an interview now, before others got the job. She agreed and started to get ready for the meeting. The firm was respectable at first sight. It was located in one of the city's most famous historic buildings. The facade was adorned with an eye-catching sign that could be seen from afar. She went up to the high marble porch and immediately fell into the hands of a respectable man who introduced himself as Mr. Sebastian, the director of the company. The solid appearance, the attentive secretary beside her, the delicious coffee on a shining copper tray, all of this made her feel at ease. And Mr. Sebastian made a very pleasant impression. He also spoke to her politely, despite her lack of office experience. He gave her a tour of the office and explained everything. Of course, we had to pay a small amount of money for training, but it was given by everyone who was present at the interview that day, and it did not seem strange. She was offered to stay on the internship, to answer the phone to those who still wanted to sign up for an interview. However, they didn't ask for her work record book, so she decided that they would talk to her later about registration. She took to the job with enthusiasm. By the end of the day, she was very praised and was told that she would be recommended for training as a junior director. The only thing was that there was a fee for the seminar, and it would be in a week's time, with a $300 deposit. Amanda, charmed by the gallant style of Mr. Sebastian and all the colleagues around her, uncomplainingly opened her wallet. Not finding her son at home, Mrs. Emily called Travis. She was concerned about his health. She was already experiencing pains, and there was no suitable opportunity to tell her son about the illness. She would have had to confess to stealing the money. But Travis didn't care about his mother's problems. Right now, he was euphoric about the imminent resolution of all his problems. "Yes, Mum," Travis answered clearly. "I'm busy. On a business trip right now. I'll be here for a while." "Son, I need to talk to you. You see, there are some health issues." "Let's do it later. It's probably not urgent. I've got things to do." Travis waved his mother away. "What about Amanda? Have you been in touch with her? Did they make up?" Mrs. Emily asked worriedly. "Leave me alone. Stay out of it. I'll come back and file for divorce. Let her go outside. She belongs there. I don't want thieves in my house," Travis replied and hung up. Mrs. Emily sighed. Now she thought she was the one responsible for the family's problems. After all, stealing the money was the reason he was so angry with his daughter-in-law. So she decided to talk to Amanda, to tell her everything, and to try to save her son's marriage somehow, even if he didn't deserve such a good attitude. But her daughter-in-law's phone didn't answer. Amanda at that time was already going to a seminar, which was held in some closed boarding house. She switched off her phone and was generally immersed in the new world of sales, especially with Mr. Sebastian around, who kept encouraging her. "What a good girl you are, Amanda. You explain everything so well. You work carefully with the others on the calls. You keep a database. I started out just like you. And now I'm opening the third branch of our company as a director." "And what is your education?" she asked. "None. I'm an orphanage kid. After the army, I survived on casual labor. Life was not happy. At one point, I thought of killing myself. I only had enough money for a night's stay in a cheap room for rent. And then this advert completely changed my life. A year later, I bought a flat, got married, and now I make other people happy, giving them chances to succeed and change their lives." "Sounds impressive," Amanda smiled. "I wish I could do the same." "You will. There are unlimited opportunities for growth in our company. Why don't you read the booklet? It's monthly." Mr. Sebastian handed her the magazine. "Here's my wife this month flying to Indonesia with other top employees. She's already a diamond director." "Wow, that's great," smiled Amanda. "Yeah, already looking forward to the changes in my life." "Yes, you're leaving the past behind. You'll have a whole new environment now." Mr. Sebastian wasn't lying. Within a month, his pyramid scheme had literally drained Amanda of all her savings. And now she was surrounded by smiling people as zombified victims of a clever scam. Her mother-in-law tried to meet with her 3 times. Her husband planned to divorce her, but Amanda didn't care. She was passionately pursuing what she thought was a career. There was no time for anything else, and money was scarce again. But Mr. Sebastian had already told her that at the end of the month they would all get a great bonus. For every employee they brought into the organization, the prospect of earning even more. Amanda was completely taken in. She unconditionally believed everything they said, and as if under hypnosis, she transferred the remaining funds from her account. Travis, meanwhile, was still staying with Mr. Will, who now had complete control over him. During this month, he had already signed over half of his company to his mistress, and he continued to solve his problems, which he himself had created. After all, he was the one who owned the plan to organize this criminal scheme. And the man in the Cadillac was his faithful assistant. It was not the first time he had pulled off such a scam to take away business with Marion's participation. She would find a trustworthy, solid businessman, always married. Then he would be gradually divvied up for gifts. His real wealth would be learnt. And then he would be set up, forced to lose his business and give up everything for the mere chance of keeping himself alive. "How's it going in there?" Travis would ask Mr. Will when he sobered up. Liters of liquor were poured into him daily. "They'll have your car back soon. You understand, the people turned out to be solid, serious. And the interest is growing every day." "The debt is increasing," Mr. Will replied. "But you, kid, don't worry. We're already a family. You live with my only daughter. I won't give you any offense." "Thanks," Travis smiled back. "I understand, different area. It's hard to decide something quickly, you know. I'm so grateful in general, both for Marion and for the opportunity to live now." The man only chuckled in response. He knew that his men were already in charge of the fool's office right now, and Travis knew nothing about it at all, though of course they couldn't hold him for long. After sending Travis off to further relax in his luxurious pool, Mr. Will called Marion over to him. "Look, daughter, something about this guy is a little too talkative. Are you giving him enough time? He ought to be out of his mind by now." "Dad, but I'm trying," Marion replied capriciously, wrinkling her pretty nose. "Well, he's so nasty when he's drunk, it's impossible. There's big money at stake. Don't let me down," threatened her father, "or you'll go back to your mother in the slums. You'll sleep there again with the first man you meet. I got you out of there, we got you cleaned up, but I can send you back." "I understand. I'll do my best," her daughter replied, and left to entertain Travis. Amanda's mother-in-law, unable to wait for help from her daughter-in-law and son, continued to live alone in the house and felt increasingly worse. One day she started bleeding. Mrs. Emily called an ambulance, and she was taken to hospital almost unconscious. Amanda was at this moment standing with Mr. Sebastian at the bank branch, taking out a loan for him as his accounts were suddenly blocked. "Amanaka helps out. I'm only asking once. Let's pay the rent for the next 3 months." "This is very urgent, and I can only trust you," Mr. Sebastian broadcast in an intimate whisper in her ear. "And as soon as the accounts are unlocked, we'll cover your loan immediately." "Good," Amanda complied as if hypnotized by her supposed employer. "You're a smart girl. Sign here." Mr. Sebastian handed the paper to the bank employee. "That's it. Let's go to the cashier's office to get the money." Amanda obediently complied with his demands. Sensing no trick, she got the money from the cashier's office, handed it to Mr. Sebastian, and then went to Linda's house for the night. She always felt strangely drowsy and apathetic when the director wasn't around. Travis was sinking further and further into alcoholic madness. Finally, he signed a waiver for the last part of his firm. All of it was now Mr. Will's property. After signing, he went to celebrate the deal and suddenly felt nauseous. His stomach felt a little better after that, though there were still some of the drugs that Mr. Will, through Marion, had generously fed Travis for 2 months running. He put his head under a stream of cold water and held it there for a couple of minutes, then dressed, heading for his benefactor's office. "What, you woke up?" He grinned as he looked at Travis, who appeared on the doorstep. "Too late, mate. You don't have a business anymore." "Give me my firm back. Travis muttered uncertainly. Well, at least part of it. You don't want anything else, he chortled hoarsely. Be thankful you're alive at all. I get it. You set me up yourself. There was no intruder in the Cadillac. I mean, that's your assistant. I'm just an idiot. Took you long enough, his interlocutor chuckled. Yeah, well, you are. Now you want to live a normal life. You'll work for me. If not, go where you came from. But know that by nightfall you'll be going into withdrawal without medication. You want to avoid that. Sit down, don't speak. And by the way, Marianne's out of your league. Forget about her. You'll get an easier girl. I've already found a new simpleton for my daughter. I'll work on him. By the way, don't let your wife claim her share of the firm. You're divorced. Marianne will give you the certificate. And a stamped passport, he said bitterly. I regret my naivety. Travis left the office. He wanted to leave this house, but the way was blocked by the guards. Travis sat down in a chair near the fireplace and thought for a long time about what a stupid thing he had done. They had been sitting at Linda's house since morning. Suddenly, she got a message from her mother-in-law, and she had forgotten that Travis had filed for divorce. Neither knew until she got the message from his phone, but she was fascinated by Mr. Sebastian. The woman did not resist fate. Her passport now also had a stamp on the divorce. Only she has not yet changed her surname. The message from her former mother-in-law seemed alarming. She decided to go to the hospital, and in the ward, talking to Mrs. Emily, felt a pain in her heart. In front of her lay an exhausted woman who she and her ex-husband had just left alone with her illness during the most difficult period. Lord, what have we done? Amanda said tearfully to Mrs. Emily. What else can we do to help you? I'm fighting as hard as I can, baby. The free treatment has already got everything. You can get an operation off the waiting list for a fee, but whether it will help or not, no one knows. Is the surgery expensive? She asked. Maybe Travis has the money? He's been ignoring my calls for 2 months now, Mrs. Emily sighed. And you two are in touch? Yes, we're divorced. And in a weird way, without him even being present. Just both agreed to the dissolution of the marriage. That's all. I wonder if he's even alive, she wondered. You know, I've been taking out a loan for someone. Now I'm thinking you and I could use the money more. I'll try to get it back. Thank you, daughter, Mrs. Emily whispered back. I didn't expect you to come at all. No, I won't leave you, she said firmly. We'll think of something. From her mother-in-law's chamber, she drove to the office of the company that had so successfully hoodwinked her all this time, unsuspecting. The receptionist led Amanda into Mr. Sebastian's office, where he was working on a new gullible simpleton. Seeing the face of the woman who entered, he quickly escorted his companion out, instructing someone else to give her the tour. Yes, Amanda, it's a little late today, Mr. Sebastian blurted out in a buttery smile. How's it going? Ready for another day of work? I need the money, she replied. I changed my mind about giving it to you. Please give it back. How much money are we talking about? Mr. Sebastian immediately became bored. Really, I haven't got anything anyway. The rent has already been paid, and the deal is not retroactive. Besides, where is it written that I owe you anything? And you have voluntarily donated money to our organization. It's documented. And by the way, thank you for such a generous gesture. Are you even normal? I work here, Amanda stated. I'm sorry. Employment papers, where are they? Mr. Sebastian laughed. Maybe just get out of here. Don't waste your time. We don't give money back. It's a matter of principle. Fine. Then I'll trash your office so that it will never work again. It's a pyramid scheme, people. And instead of a salary, you're in for one huge disappointment. Don't give your money to these crooks. Well, shut up, or you won't get out of here alive. Mr. Sebastian nodded to the guard. Don't let that one in here again. Amanda was dragged outside and dumped on the porch of the building. She pounded on the doors, angry, but mostly at herself, then walked away to tell her friend about everything. So it's not a firm, just a scam. And I got you into it. What a nightmare. I see you're walking around like you're lost. What do we do now? I want to punish them, she said gravely, and take back all their money that they put into the pyramid scheme. And let's search the internet, see what they have on them. Maybe these figures have already been on the radar somewhere. They entered the data of the company, studied the documents that fell out in the search. The company was indeed famous, had a bad reputation. Under this name operated a pyramid scheme, and it wasn't owned by Mr. Sebastian. That didn't make it any easier. But they soon found Mr. Sebastian in the court registry. True, he had never yet been convicted for his actions. Mr. Sebastian had a website dedicated to him online, run by someone who cared. He was posting news about the scammers' movements there, warning against cooperating with this swindler. "Oh, we should have looked here sooner," Amanda said sadly. "But that's what to do now." "Wait," Linda reassured her. "Look, this site is run by an ex-cop. He detained this Mr. Sebastian, and then got hurt because of him and was fired." "And how does that help us?" Amanda asked. "Who thought this search was a waste of time? We need the money for the operation soon. Then it'll be too late. Look, there's an email address. Let's write to him," her friend suggested. "It wouldn't be any worse. What if this Michael guy can actually do something to help? Look how many years he's been at war with that Mr. Sebastian guy." "There's nothing to lose," she replied. "Maybe something will actually work out." They wrote and sent an email outlining the circumstances. There was little hope, and they were going to go looking for work in the morning. But a reply came within an hour. The email included a phone number and a request to call. She immediately contacted the person. "Hello, this is me writing to you," and fell for the scammers. "Sad," replied the man, who introduced himself as Michael, though of course he wasn't technically tried. "That Mr. Sebastian managed to get away with it somehow back then. And the brass put me on the hook. Good thing I had enough seniority to retire. I'm a private investigator now. I don't take orders very often, though. I have a license. At first I drank non-stop out of anger and despair, but then I came to my senses and was horrified. You can help me, you know. Without that money, my mother-in-law." "Well, you mean my ex-husband's mother will die?" Amanda pleaded, interrupting the man's confession. "I'd love to hear your life story, but later, when the issues are resolved. Forgive me if this sounds impolite. Tell me straight away, what are you willing to do to save your former mother-in-law?" Michael replied. "Anything," Amanda said without hesitation. You see, she found herself so alone, so defenseless. "Are you ready to blackmail your enemy?" "I have some dirt on him, but you'll have to do it. I don't want to be exposed. I have a dream to nail this guy someday." "Yes, I am. Look, when can you give me your dirt?" Amanda asked impatiently. "Tomorrow morning. Write down the address and come over. I'll be waiting. Just please don't go back on your word." "I wasn't going to," Amanda grinned. "I'm angry with that man. You have no idea how angry." The next morning she drove to the outskirts of town to the address Michael had given her. Contrary to expectation, what she found there was not an elderly retired man, but quite a brawny and rather young man. "And you're a retired man?" Amanda laughed. "No way." "You flatter me," Michael smiled. "Just celebrated my 40th birthday a week ago. By any chance, have you never played on the national team? Very much the same athlete." "Well, except for junior," Amanda replied, "in swimming." "So that's you." Michael cheered. "Can I have your autograph? I've always cheered for you at competitions, even though I'm supposed to be cheering for my department." Amanda blushed at the compliment, signed her picture. Michael had it in a prominent place. It was an amateur picture, apparently taken by him. It was nice to be reminded of her athletic past, but that wasn't why she'd come here. "Michael, let's still about the dirt. What do you have? And how does that help?" "Yes, of course. I have documents denouncing Mr. Sebastian's scams. I think he'd be happy to buy them from you." "Well, how do you organize all this safely?" "I can't take any risks, especially now. We have to get the money and at least try to save Mrs. Emily," Amanda explained. "Help. You must have experience in this sort of thing, surely. Do you have some strange idea of police work?" Michael smiled. "But I'm really willing to help. Anyway, listen to the plan." They talked for quite a while. Then she proceeded to act on her new acquaintance's instructions, sitting at his house waiting for Mr. Sebastian's reaction to the dirt she had sent him. The woman was nervous. Michael had found meat and onions in the fridge, and there was flour on the shelf. "Look, I need something to keep my hands busy. Why don't I make some dumplings? I'm good at making dumplings." "I'd be happy to help you," Michael replied. "How did you end up in this situation in the first place?" "Since I left my husband and lost my job. So I fell for the tricks of scammers. And then, like a spiral, the further you go, the harder it is to get out." "Why did you quit sports?" Michael asked. "You were the best." "Health reasons. And as an adult, my results weren't the same. I was treated for a long time, lost time. And they don't keep sick people on the national team," she replied. "I see. And I, as you can see, am just a retired loser. No wife, no kids. I live with a cat. Oh, I don't have either. Just a mother-in-law. I can't give birth to children, so I can forget about happy motherhood right away. Unemployed, homeless, the whole package. But if you're looking for a job, I suggest you come to me as a secretary. I alone do not have time to enter data into the file and work." Michael offered, "I can't promise you a big salary, but I'll pay you fairly. And you can live here too. It's a big house, 2 halves. There's plenty of room. There's no office as such. We work from here. Well, you could consider it a home office." "I'll think about it," she promised, just as she put the dumplings on the boil. Just then the phone beeped. Her message was answered. Mr. Sebastian was offering to meet and talk. "Don't accept. Let them transfer the money. They'll get the dirt by courier," Michael replied. She sent a message. The scammer agreed to all the demands she made, and an hour later a transfer message from the bank appeared on the screen. She received all the money, both the money she had invested in her studies and the credit money. She screamed with joy and threw herself around Michael's neck. "We did it, Michael. Do you understand?" "Of course, I'm very happy about it. So can we run to save my mother-in-law?" Michael answered her, gently placing Amanda on the floor. "And I'll eat these delicious dumplings and think of you. And I'll make some more. You're welcome to eat them." "Do you accept my offer?" Michael smiled. "I'm willing to wait until you solve your problems." "I'll go to work on Monday," Amanda shouted as she left his flat. That same day, she paid for her mother-in-law's surgery. It was performed and even successful. But time was running out. Of course, there was an improvement, but her body could no longer cope with the strain. It was clear Mrs. Emily didn't have much time left. The doctors told her she was weeks away from death. Her mother-in-law tearfully thanked Amanda anyway for her care and dedication. "Here's the thing, honey," she said. "I'm disinheriting my son. I'm bequeathing everything to you. Tomorrow we'll call a notary, have him draw up a will in full form. And also memorize the last orders, something my son will definitely not be interested in. By the way, tomorrow go to our house. Bring a box of jewelry from my room. We'll try to turn this junk into money." "Oh, really? Those are your favorite rings and bracelets?" Amanda exclaimed. "I've always admired them." "And you can't take all that wealth with you to the afterlife," sighed Mrs. Emily. "Will you at least have something to pay a nurse in my last weeks?" "Well, it wouldn't hurt to organize a decent send-off either. There's no hope for my son. God save him. He sent me a named daughter, She cried and put her arms round Mrs. Emily. Together the women sat quietly for some time, discussing the coming change. The next day the will was drawn up. Mrs. Emily was moved from the hospital to a fee-for-service hospice. It was clear that the time that wasn't much left was better spent in dignified care. Travis, who had finally read his mother's messages, traveled to the hospital but did not find her there. His calls to Mrs. Emily were not answered. That's when the ex-husband contacted Amanda. "What do you know that Mum is ill? I'm asking you. On top of that, she's gone somewhere. I can't find her anywhere." "Mrs. Emily is in a hospice," she replied, "and she doesn't have long to live." "Ah, that's great. I'll sell the house. I need the money badly." "I'm afraid there's going to be a problem with that. Your mum wrote a will." "And who's the heir? Kelly, some of the nurses?" "No," Amanda replied quietly, "so I'm sorry there's no way to sell the house." "Have you got any nerve at all?" Travis shouted into the phone. "Give me the address of that hospice. I'm going to beat the hell out of my mother. I'll have her rewrite her will to her own son. What the hell is this nonsense? She never even loved you. Travis did go to visit his mother, but she didn't want to see him. She only agreed to talk to him on the phone, and even then she was absolutely adamant. "Travis, I renounce you," Mrs. Emily said sadly into the receiver. "I no longer have a son. A stranger turned out to be closer and more family than the one I gave birth to and raised." "Come on, I've only been gone a couple of months. Why are you being dramatic?" Travis shouted into the phone. "And anyway, this is my house. I only put it in your name so I wouldn't leave it to you in the divorce." "Well, you won't. I'll take care of it myself. It'll compensate the girl for the years she spent with a man like you." "Your girl's a bitch," he yelled. "Change your will, quick." "You know, son, I've realized there are no pockets in the other world. At least respect the decision of a dying woman." "All right, I won't stoop to a trivial fight over inheritance. But Mum, where am I supposed to live now?" Travis was indignant. "Are you leaving your own son penniless?" "What about the business? I helped you set it up once, didn't I?" Mrs. Emily inquired. "It's not mine anymore," Travis muttered. They ended the conversation, and a month later Mrs. Emily quietly passed away in her sleep. Amanda kept her mother-in-law's most favorite jewelry. They were what the woman wore at the moment of parting. Travis refused to come to the funeral, saying that the deceased has heirs. Let them handle all the formalities. Amanda didn't argue with that. She had fulfilled all her promises. Amanda stepped happily into her new life with Michael's house and their shared work. It turned out there were plenty of responsibilities for a secretary at his private agency. All this month she'd been creating a case catalog and client database. She felt confident at the computer, and Michael's presence at her side made it easy to understand even the most complicated handwriting. A month later, they were practically inseparable and talked about everything. Michael had even confessed his feelings to Amanda. But there was still one thing she didn't know. "How do you feel about children?" Michael asked her one day. "Are you ready to be a mum?" "Look, I've been through this before," Amanda sighed. "There's no more hormones in trying to get pregnant." "That's not what I'm talking about. You see, I have one unfulfilled promise in my life. As a matter of fact, I once shot a man, a thug, while apprehending him. But that doesn't change anything, does it? He was ready to surrender at the time, and I shot him. Anyway, I'd already served my time for all that, and I drank a lot. I thought I'd go mad, and I went to the orphanage and made amends as best I could." "What do children have to do with it?" Amanda asked, perplexed. "What have they got to do with the real gangster?" "That's what I'm telling you. He had a son, practically a newborn at the time. Then his mother died, and the boy ended up in an orphanage. He's still there. I wanted to take him in, but they don't give them to single men. They said if he was a family man, no problem." "So what, you're suggesting we adopt the kid?" Amanda asked. "No. Well, I'm not opposed to it at all. I'm just not really sure how it's all going to work out yet." "Well, first we have to get signed," Michael smiled. "Will you marry me?" "Yes, I will," Amanda nodded in response. "Just let's dispense with the bouffant dresses and all that." They applied. At the same time, Amanda entered into an inheritance and then put the house on the market. Contrary to promises, Travis did not challenge his mother's last will. Now he himself lived in Pavlov's house and was one of his most loyal assistants. And he had heard about Michael's reputation and did not want to make such an enemy. The house where she lived with her ex-husband unexpectedly quickly went under the hammer, and for a good price. She'd put the money in the bank. Now she had financial insurance, and soon she and Michael were husband and wife. At the ceremony, besides the newlyweds, were Linda and Michael's best friend David. After the ceremony, they sat in a cozy cafe and separated. Amanda and her husband went to the orphanage. She couldn't wait to meet Thomas. That was the name of the boy they planned to adopt. The children were out for a walk when they arrived. Brightly colored jackets and hats flashed here and there. Michael turned his head, trying to see where Thomas was, but he couldn't find the boy. He saw him from a distance and ran towards him. The boy jumped and hung around the man's neck. You've been gone so long. I missed you terribly. And who is this, your girlfriend?" "That's my wife. We got married today," Michael replied. "And we want to ask you if you'll be part of our new family." "She's okay with that." The white-haired, funny-looking kid, who looked like a fungus in his huge hat, hesitated. "What if she doesn't like children? Have you checked?" By the way, her name is Amanda." The woman interrupted the silence. "And you're Thomas, aren't you? Let's get acquainted." He stepped closer to her, took a long look at her face, and then suddenly embraced her. Amanda hugged the boy back and cried, but she couldn't stop. At that moment, her heart was melting with tenderness. "What, are you going to be my mum?" A serious Thomas asked her. "It wouldn't work otherwise, would it?" Of course, she smiled. "We'll have it real." Thomas turned to his friends and shouted at the top of his voice, "Look, it's my dad and mum." Jumping up and down, he dragged Michael and Amanda around the grounds, showing them everything he knew and loved. The bright beds of autumn flowers, fading but still beautiful, the steep slide that the children were screaming down, the fat cat near the dining room. Amanda walked along, smiling and nodding, unable to believe her happiness. This boy seemed to erase her sad past with his presence and gave her hope for the future. The formalities took some time, but 6 months later Thomas, who officially had the status of an orphan, became their son. Another 6 months later, she realized that she was constantly vomiting. A visit to the doctor revealed that they were expecting a child, despite all the negative predictions. Amanda turned out to be pregnant. Thomas was eagerly awaiting the arrival of his baby sister. He was sure it would be a girl, and so it was. The entire female side of the family was welcomed home from the hospital. Amanda looked at her men, big and small, from the porch, with the baby in her arms, feeling boundless happiness. Everything in her life was now exactly as she wanted it to be. The son kicked out the village mother in a snowstorm. A year later, when he came to visit her, Emily lovingly stroked the smooth side of the glass cylinder with pickles, leaned over it, inhaled the pleasant aroma of fresh dill, garlic, cherry leaves, which she was sure to add to her preparations. Now she would close the next batch with metal lids, roll it up, put it to cool, and then take it to the cellar to the shelves. She thought for the 100th time that this year there was a good harvest of vegetables in the vegetable garden, and she herself would not go hungry in the winter. And she had prepared supplies for her son Archie in the city. Behind her back, in the corner of the summer kitchen, there was a faint sound and some inarticulate mumbling. It was her mother Helen awake, peacefully dozing, whispers, smells, the gurgling of pickles on the stove. A sturdy couch with a pile of old blankets and pillows had been there since ancient times. Now she had dragged Ellen there on her own to keep the old woman in sight. Although she was not quite ancient, only a little over 70 years old, she had not been on her feet for 5 years. The doctors then only waved their hands. "We do not observe any physical abnormalities, no stroke or other symptoms that could give an order to the legs not to walk. There is no history of any. And they keep their lower limbs on their own. Your mother's more frail body refuses to fulfill its physiological purpose." Grandmother Helene is a well-known personality in the village. Back in the days when the Soviet kolkhoz ruled everything in the village, not a single matter of importance could be done without her ubiquitous nose. A small woman, just like Thumbelina, in appearance and in character. She could run the farm. Nobody drove the cows to the field for haying better than her. The men could never keep up with her. When she digs potatoes in her vegetable garden, people marvel. They are still checking where to put the tubers for drying. Ellen already has dry and even potatoes in bags, waiting for their hour. Lubia even called her our eternal engine. Where did they dig up such a term in those times? Peasants can't keep up with science. Someone from the visiting business travelers dropped this nickname. After the perky little girl, everyone picked it up at once. The village perpetual motion machine could not cope with the loads overnight. It fell out of working order, as if the battery inside had run out of charge. Emily herself was a tall and statuesque woman. Not a particularly fit woman, but she wasn't exactly overweight. She was all juicy, appetizing, tall, with huge blue eyes of all shades of cornflower, and a kerchief always tied around her, covering a mop of light, thick hair. Spoiled Max in the army and clothes. In the old days they would say, "Here she is, a real American beauty." But Emily didn't care for these compliments. She would pick up her mother, light as a fluff ball, and drag her into the cradle of an old motorcycle. She handled that mechanical inheritance of her father's. Her father has long gone to the other world, but managed to accustom his daughter to friendship with the iron helper. And the countryside motorcycle a godsend, something to transport small things to the store to run to get provisions, 1 centner of sugar for jams and compotes, and to buy on wheels a nice thing, to solve all sorts of problems. So now the street did not keep my mother in the 4 walls of the house. To the river to refresh in the cool water, while Mom on a blanket in the shade of willow will sit. Together they went to a distant berry plot with strawberries, red and black currants. Also in the company of Ellen. Emily wanders along the rows with a bow, Mom near the motorcycle on a blanket buckets with the harvest guarding. There, both women are not in grief alone. They have their own blood a point at their side. It's good to be alive. Infirm Matthew didn't see his beloved husband. He would have been sad. He burned to death 6 years ago from a simple flu. His immune system had already weakened with age, and the disease had a dead grip on him. He was almost 20 years older than his wife, and still remembered how their collective farm had been raised from the ruins after World War II, how they had plowed and sown almost by hand, without machinery. Matvey first saw the eyes of his young wife Helen among the cows. The sometimes capricious milk suppliers obeyed this impudent girl unconditionally. The man then thought that it seemed that the young lady was afraid of her soul and diligently gave her everything that had gathered in their uterus. There was no time for dating and courtship in that hard time. At the evening in the village club, Matthew spoke to the locals as a specialist sent from a neighboring, more prosperous region to help. He called for victorious labor, inspired to exploits. After his speech, the girl herself came up to him and extended a small, strong palm. "You said everything right, comrade. Who, if not us, will raise the farm to new heights? Let's get acquainted. I'm Ellen. If you need help, please contact me." By the way, 40-year-old Matthew was very handsome and smiling, had that very male charm which the female sex will never pass indifferently. All the widows in the village were already looking at him with interest, but he did not notice anyone and nothing around him. As he came out of the club with Helen to walk her home and discuss the affairs of the collective farm, he fell in love definitively and irrevocably. His feelings were mutual. His soul was not embarrassed neither by the difference in age, nor by the sarcastic sneers of his comrades. Little girl chose an old man as her soulmate. A small gold mine, but a dear one. To the visiting father turned out to be, "Look, turrets, and the girl is spinning our collective farm leader." Matthew and Ellen got married right after the end of harvesting. The traveling specialist had no place of his own. Ellen's parents did not say a word against their love. He came to the Primakovs in a small house of his wife's parents and lived there for the rest of his life. Together parents, and in time spent the last journey. Next to the woman he loved, everything seems easier and simpler. After 3 years of marriage, they had Emily. I wish her parents had a brother or sister later. Yes, Ellen's doctors didn't advise her to take any more risks. There were delegations from the maternity hospital to the pediatric ward. The baby was born a girl giant, almost 60 centimeters of height and 5 kilograms of weight. The doctors were saying, "We have you, mommy, a total female anomaly. Such tiny babies do not give birth to such large babies. We could send your information to the Guinness Book of Records." Matthew and Ellen only smiled, so our father is 2 meters tall, a slouch in the shoulders. We have someone to give our daughter a big birth. Subsequently, no giant Emily was not marked. She grew and developed like all other peers. Beauty in her father, energy in her mother. It was a strange combination. Now she was approaching 50 years of age. And the fact that I was endowed with beauty from my parents and God, I never recognized it. She always walked past mirrors in passing, not looking into them unnecessarily, at dances and festivals in the shadow of other village beauties. One joy in the world's son Arson, who lives in the regional center. Now she will deal with cucumbers, zucchini and cherry jam. Mom, thank God, with a bright mind and good memory, word and advice will always support. She would come and stroke her head, stare into her eyes with her clear gaze. I thought to myself that the fact that her mother's legs had failed was pain, hopelessness. That the hour of her husband Matthew came to the graveyard to come to terms. A woman in love with this loss could not. Her legs refused. but grooms on the now empty land for her without her beloved by her side to tread. Emily picked up her mother with a familiar motion, pulling her by the arm. "Now I'll take you, my good one. We'll have tea afterward. I got your favorite cookies from the store." Helene put her arms around her daughter's neck, pressed her cheek against her warm shoulder. "My poor girl. Why did you have such a heavy cross of struggle and loneliness in this life, forever giving your heart to one single man? Why have you suffered such anguish of womanly longing?" Images from 30 years ago swam before Emily's eyes. In the late 80s, the Soviet Union was like a colossus on legs of clay. Dusty, hot rural summers, the kolkhoz, which had given a lot of resources, could barely cope with the tasks. People fled to the city. Physical labor in the field was no longer the pride of the toilers. After the death of the communist leader, the country changed several rulers. The last one declared glasnost in the fight against drunkenness. It became unclear how to go on living. The collective farm managed to harvest watermelons and melons. A student group was sent from the city. They settled them in a school. No money was promised. The collective farm was impoverished, but they promised to feed them in the club so that the young people would not get bored. In the evenings, they played movies and organized discos. Emily had just finished school. She caught a cold when the students went swimming in the river. When it was time to apply for university, she dreamed of becoming a biologist. But the girl came down with a fever over 40. They wanted to put her in the hospital, but Ellen said that she would cure her daughter herself. At the family council, it was decided that she should not go to the army, but work in the village for a year, and the next year to enroll. A suitable vacancy was found quickly: assistant cook in the student canteen. 2 women did not have time to serve 50 people 3 times a day for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. The townspeople were squeamish about rubbing the utensils with napkins, asking to wash the dishes again. They were in desperate need of a nimble and savvy helper. Here's my revision of the text, following your instructions. Emily recovered from her illness a week after the students arrived in the village. She had not yet met any of them. When Ellen's friend complained that she and her partner had been knocked off their feet in the dining hall, Ellen remarked gravely, "I'll be of more use in the fields and on the ruins of our once prosperous farm. And let Emily go and help. You needn't let her sit at home all summer. She's quite well now." The work in the canteen was marked by a bright, extraordinary event. The girl at the new workplace on the first day went with a tray full of glasses with compote. Before lunch, yes, on a small puddle at the table slipped. Set on a tray of fragile dishes flew to the floor, as in slow motion. A few seconds later, a bright maroon stain blurred, dotted with small glasses. Emily rushed to collect them in her apron, so that the students already at the tables wouldn't cut themselves. The treacherous piece of glass entered her hand so quickly that she didn't even feel the pain at first. Just above her palm, a purple stain began to blur. Droplets that looked like red rowan berries dripped onto the floor. Emily felt dizzy. The crowd gathered around her was shrugged off by some guy. "Get out of the way. My dad's a surgeon. I know how to provide expert care for wounds this deep. Get the first aid kit." What's a first aid kit in a village canteen? A bottle of iodine, an empty bandage packet, small narrow tubes of plaster rolled up like a roll, analgin tablets. That was all the medical stock. Seeing that the first aid kit would not help, the boy sharply pulled off his light-colored cotton shirt and tore it into a bandage. Carefully took out the glass that had caught the end in the girl's arm, treated the wound with iodine, and wrapped a cloth around it. "That's it. You'll get to the local paramedic in peace now, and I'll walk you there. Let's get acquainted, shall we? My name is Vincent." Emily looked up at her healer. Tall, slender. The face of an intelligent city boy with gray, intelligent, age-inappropriate eyes. He looks at her directly, openly, with a smile. Vincent is already holding out his hand to walk together to the village nurse's station. He's even going to skip lunch for the occasion. He'll be hungry for the rest of the evening because of her. Some fellow was already holding out to Vincent the plaid shirt he was wearing over his t-shirt. The unwilling doctor deftly pulled it over his strong torso and smiled at the student. "I'll have your closet back to you in an hour." "Thanks, friend, helped out." "I don't care. I have to change," Emily told her savior. She thought to herself, he's nothing like our local guys. Clean, neat, polite. not like Greg and her high school boyfriend. Shirt always open, dirty pants, all stained, cigarette in the corner of his thin, predatory lips. What kind of a groom is he? In vain, they were already matched with each other in the village. No offense, but my favorite Max refused my offer to dine with me, Vincent said. I'll hand you over to your village doctor. Then we'll go. That's a fine word. Aesculapius, Emily thought at a loss. One must keep one's ear to the ground with these city folk. Always they have words abstruse, quotations from books, and she had never held other printed editions in her hands, except for fiction from the school curriculum and a large colorful book in the world of fauna and flora. After that book, and she had a dream to become a biologist and study the animal world. But for the time being, these bright prospects were pushed away from her for a whole year because of the unfortunate bronchitis. They walked in silence to the nurse's station. Vincent didn't ask her any questions, seeing that she occasionally wrinkled her nose in pain. The paramedic in the office praised the man who'd been next to the injured waitress. Look how skillfully the wound is treated. Who was able to do it so clearly? I did the best I could, without false modesty, Vincent announced. I come from a family of hereditary surgeons. My father, mother, grandfather, it's as if they were all born with a scalpel in their hands. It would be foolish for me not to have basic first aid skills. After handing Emily over to the medical officer as promised, the boy bowed courteously and disappeared out the door. Emily could only look at him with annoyance and conclude that such a man would not make a long acquaintance with a village girl. Not to her liking, even if his eyes were as blue as lakes. Too refined, urban. A prince from a fairy tale read to them as a child by a kindergarten teacher. He wouldn't follow his princess to the dining room door in a carriage. Emily was wrong. The next day, the first person she saw outside the dining room was Vincent. He greeted her again with his impossibly warm smile and said, I have the day off after 3 shifts at Bakhtin. Why don't I help you set the tables? Your arm's in bandages. It's early. I don't think it stopped hurting. We can do it better together. Then we'll go to the movies. They're showing an old comedy at the club today. Ivan Vasilievich changes profession. Have you seen that movie before? Emily's feet had been knocked off the ground. She's not the one being greeted by a real knight in the cafeteria. She's not the one called to the movies after work, or offered to help with trays, forks, and spoons. It couldn't be, because it could never be. But it was happening in real life. Vincent didn't seem at all intent on hiding his obvious interest in her. Emily banished the memories that had come flooding back to her after fiddling with the string of pickle jars. She sat Ellen down at the table in a soft blanket, so that she could finally end the day with some aromatic herbal tea. Summer was soon rolling smoothly into its second half. Time fled, not as it had in her youth, stretching like sweet molasses. Annoyed, Ellen asked to go to bed after tea. It was time for her to go to bed herself. She had grand plans for this summer's warmth and pickles, so long as there were no problems. She'd pack up some presents for New Year's Eve in the fall. It was unlikely that she would be able to get out to the city before then. The last thoughts of the woman had already sunk into a blissful sleep. Tomorrow is a new day and new worries. Emily was a good hostess. What she could not cook from the gifts of the vegetable garden and the garden. It was her and Mama Ellen's house that was old and dilapidated, and everything that grew on the ground and in the ground always succeeded to the glory. Having finished the epic with cucumbers, she switched to caviar from zucchini or juice, which she cooked from all the fruits ripening on the trees. It was her turn to put the tomatoes in jars. Then to cut apricots, apples, plums, and pears into large slices and send them to sunbathe on metal sheets under the sun. My son has always respected dried fruit compote. He could make it himself at home in the city. It was a simple matter. Emily looked down at the sacks of potatoes, at the makeshift nets made of old stockings and stuffed with golden onions, and sighed. Though she still seemed to have the strength to carry all this wealth into town herself. Would she have to go to Greg again? He'll start his chatter. I've been waiting 30 years for you to marry me. I'll give up the gorilla and the vodka. You know me. She'll smoke all the way to the cabin. I can't breathe. Yeah, pelting her with salty jokes and lewd innuendos. He just won't let it go, the old dog. Long married, 3 grown-up children, grandchildren already. And he keeps looking questioningly into her eyes, as if he wants to read something in them. Don't believe that first high school love never rusts. Since she was young, Greg had been her eternal sighing partner. But he never got anything. One thing's for sure, if she asks him to drive his truck to Archie's, he'll never say no. By the morning of December 25th, a blizzard was brewing. Emily had already arranged with her neighbor Maggie to look after 2 or 3 bags for Archie. Emily had packed such bulky bags that faithful Greg only shouted when he saw them on the doorstep. "Be thankful my heart is heavy for you. No fool would have agreed to haul all that stuff into town on our dirt road to the highway. Only my iron horse can do it with 4-wheel drive and off-road capabilities. Would you haul your bags to the bag on a motorcycle? Emily, I wouldn't be so nice to you." Emily hurriedly slipped him a pre-prepared bottle of her famous Naluka made from all the seasonal fruits and berries. The secret of this strong elixir was simple: whatever fruit or berry was ripe, they were poured in a layer on the bottom of a 10-liter container up to half, covered with sugar, then the next layer of ripe fruit, and so on until the last autumn harvest of frost-resistant berries. We let it insist for 21 days, picked, separating from the rest of the fruit and berries, and then topped up with vodka from the village store, for residual disinfection. The result was a drink of unprecedented flavor. The whole village was waiting for Emily and Ellen to treat them to this gift. Greg pushed the bag of money away. He grabbed Emily's hand. "There is no such gift. I have been waiting for so many years from you, my grandmother. You are alone. A century. You are not a stone, Emily, nor ice. I can't believe you're still faithful to your first love. It doesn't work like that." Emily shoved Greg away in her heart and gritted her teeth. "You can be the only man on this planet. I'll never be yours. You hear me, Greg? You don't know what it's like." "All your life one man remember to love?" Greg asked. "How many times have you and I already brought up this subject? I consider you a friend, not by way of a hitchhiker, a heavy drinker, but not evil. But why are you playing that song again? We shouldn't pick sweet berries together, but bitter berries. I cut everything off without you a long time ago. Even the idea of starting the car. It's going to snow soon. And you still have to get back to the village by daylight. The days are so short, it'll be dark before you know it." Archie was in high spirits this morning. The New Year's Eve party at his firm had been timed to coincide with Catholic Christmas. On this occasion, this Saturday was rented a nice cozy cafe near their office. Since some time ago, a new female employee from the marketing department has been actively making eyes at him. Tonight, he would invite her to his house after the party for a cup of coffee. Archie sighed dreamily and mentally assured himself, "Chicks like me. I change them like worn-out gloves that don't fit into the last closet. This young lady will not resist," he was sure of his complete male irresistibility. So look, and New Year's vacations he and this person will spend together. Someone has to make Olivier salad for the festive table, and finally to put in order in his bachelor's den. Pretty face and appetizing figure of the new girl will be an additional prize. He'd already broken up with his ex-girlfriend 2 weeks ago. It was time to find her a worthy replacement from those who are not puzzled by complexes. He won't be dragged to the registry office. The redhead from the neighboring department was definitely from this carefree cohort of girls. Winter celebrations promised a lot of pleasant surprises. Coming out of the shower in only a towel, Archie heard a knock at the door. He hurried to open it. "Mom, what are you doing here in town?" he wondered. "I wasn't expecting you. You're in the wrong place today." For some reason, Emily was immediately confused by the cold reception. She wanted to hug her son. She missed him. On the diplomat in her hands, but he squeamishly removed her hands. "You should warn me about your unexpected visits," Archie said. "I might have other plans for the near future. And now you're here. How did you manage to surprise me? What are you dragging across the threshold? Look at your wet footprints on the floor." The events that followed seemed like a bad dream to Emily for a long time afterward. Archie angrily kicked the sack of potatoes, pushed aside the bag of onions, lovingly packed by his mother in a plastic bag so that they wouldn't get wet. With annoyance, he settled down on a large bag with pickles. "How could you think, Mother, that I was starving here? There's a supermarket around the corner. The shelves are full of goods." "I tried to get you some things for the winter holidays," Emily said. "Archie's used to all his own, homemade, natural." "Don't be such a country bumpkin," Archie said angrily. I've been a city dweller for a long time and I live by the rules of a big metropolis. I'm not going to waste time on your culinary riches. Pack all this stuff back up. And next time you'll give me a little more notice of your visit. I don't need a mother hen mooching over me like a little chicken. I think you have an old friend in town who's lonely. Go to her with all these presents. Make the old lady happy with a New Year's offering. The young man grabbed the grocery bags and started carrying them out to the entrance, without letting his mother enter the apartment, without at least offering to warm herself with tea. Emily couldn't believe this wasn't happening to her. Her son couldn't do this to her. What evil spells had this town put him under? The truck is probably already out of town and headed for home. She hadn't corresponded with her city friend in over a year. How to know if it was possible to visit her now, or would she also give her the runaround? The snowstorm was getting worse outside. The snow was falling not in large fluffy snowflakes, but in a sharp and chopping way. It was too early to reveal a face uncovered by clothes and headdresses. Archie, meanwhile, carried all his mother's presents out into the empty yard. The yard glistened in this weather, and darkness was slowly descending on Chicago, which liked to come early in the cold season. "I called a cab for you," Archie said. "I hope you remember your high school buddy's address clearly. I've wasted so much time with you. I've got to get cleaned up for the New Year's Eve party. You should know that. I'm going through some changes in my personal life. There's nothing for you to do here in Chicago anytime soon. I'll be fine on my own. I'm going to be 30 years old in April. I don't need your pesky tutelage anymore." A young guy came to the call, fussily began to put food supplies in the trunk, all the time looking back at the angry man, and for some reason the woman, who was writhing in pain, even thought to himself there's something wrong between them. He is saying something to her. She looks pitifully and covers her face with her palm. But it's none of my business. I'll fulfill the order and go on my way. New Year's Eve and the vacations themselves if you try for a couple of months. Then, until spring will feed me. Emily got into the car without looking back. It was so unbearably painful, as if something bright, always warming her soul, had been doused with viscous, stinking marsh mud. No bath gels and foams could wash it away. No bath gels and foams could drown out the vile odor of her soul's decay. She always bought in the store all these fragrant accessories for bathing, to pamper, to please Helene. The old woman was always delighted to smell them at home. But here, in this case, the vibes of the subtle odors were unable to remove that blackness. She only relaxed when she climbed into the back seat. The tears came in streams. There was no stopping their rapid flow. Though she didn't like to show weakness in public, she couldn't hold back. The driver asked her sympathetically, "Where are we going, lady?" The answer shocked him. "You can throw me out in a clear field," Emily said. "My son didn't even ask if I had the money to pay you for the job. Prices are different in the city. I don't have enough cash reserves for a long trip. You know," she suddenly became lively, "I can pay you back with village products. I have excellent potatoes, some onions, cylinders with cucumbers and tomatoes from my own beds. Will that pay?" This cab driver had seen a lot of things in his 2 years in Chicago, but he had never read such hopeless sorrow in anyone's eyes. It's like she just gave up a living son. He was now taking this woman to nowhere. And it felt like she'd just buried him. It didn't take him long to make up his mind, but soon he said, "Why do we need your gifts, Ma? I am. Can't we find a plate of pilaf and a cup of hot tea for a good man?" "What if I'm bad?" Emily asked. "Come on, I'm not kidding. I have a good eye. I can always tell an honest and kind heart from a bad and deceitful one. I'm going to bring you back to my house. Don't be afraid of anything around me." Emily didn't have many highlights in her life, except a few trips with Archie to the sea and those happy times when they were so attached to each other. Once they arrived in sunny Miami, they both immediately fell in love with this southern land with azure sea, sand dunes, the cries of seagulls, daring dolphins swimming directly to the shore. Then, after high school, Archie graduated from a technical university in Chicago, and so there in the dormitory at first and stayed. He didn't make such a brilliant career, but his income was enough for his current expenses. Then I rented a cozy 2-room apartment almost in the center. He spent a lot of time in the company of student friends, and then colleagues. Emily soberly realized that a grown-up young man cannot keep near the mother's skirt. In her hometown in the last 2 or 3 years, he no longer visited. Emily didn't own any modern gadgets. All communication was through an old button cell phone. Archie called her no more than once or twice a month, reducing communication to brief questions and answers. And the connection in her backwoods town was stable, but in bad weather it failed. Their estrangement from each other was probably inevitable. But why did it hurt so much today then? Emily visited her son every year under the New Year's holiday with country guests. His current reaction had put her in a stupor. Or had something seriously changed in Archie's soul in this tough town? She hadn't noticed. Only questions were bouncing around in her head right now. And there were no answers. The silent cab driver drove her to the outskirts of Chicago to one of the houses that used to be solidly inhabited by tenants of communal apartments. She was not mistaken one of those huge apartments with many doors opening into a hallway and an impressive kitchen. She and a young boy had entered. At first she was confused. Within the walls of this apartment lived a whole Tabor, which now spilled out of all the rooms to consider the unexpected guest. There was a speech she did not understand, but there was no aggression in its tone. The fellow cab driver stopped all debate in a flash. A couple minutes later, she was ushered into an empty room with a small sofa, a coffee table, and an old TV on a dresser, rugs with national ornaments on the walls and floor. Women with smiles handed her a set of bed linens, a large blanket, terry towels, and house slippers. Brand new. Emily somehow immediately warmed in that welcoming warmth. After a couple minutes, she caught up. "Please, let's get my supplies from the trunk. Not as payment for your help, not for your wonderful hospitality, just for fun. In them and every potato, cucumber, tomato, a part of my soul. I really want you to feel it." Having consulted among themselves, the residents of the apartment sent a whole delegation to the car, while the cab driver hurriedly snacked on something in the kitchen. An hour later, when her savior, who had been driving all day to feed his family, had long since disappeared in the blizzard, Emily was called into the kitchen. She went in and marveled. There were so many people at the big long table that her eyes were scattered. She thought, what a friendly people. They can't all be members of the same family. At the head of the table sat an elderly woman. Further along the perimeter, younger people. Many children. The men in this tribe from Central Asia were almost all still at work. Their bread in a foreign land was certainly not easy. Emily realized that local traditions and long-established household rituals were familiar from childhood. How difficult it was for these people from distant lands to accept the rules imposed on them and survive in an unfamiliar reality. A leisurely dinner began. The hearty meal was crowned by a large cast iron with a scattering of pilaf, which everyone at the table, as soon as they got a plate in their hands, neatly and skillfully ate directly with their hands. Next to the pilaf was a pile of boiled potatoes sprinkled with coarse salt, which for some reason did not dissolve in the moist steam. Everywhere around the edges were containers of Emily's pickles. One of the young women picked up a green cucumber and took a bite. The other women followed her example, and soon they were clucking approvingly, giving the master a thumbs up in approval. What a strange day it is, Emily thought after dinner. It's only 9 p.m. and already my eyes are traitorously slipping. Not a single person at the table asked her a single question, as if she'd been living with them for 1,000 years. The nearest neighbor then showed her where the bathroom was and escorted her to her temporary abode. Amazing, the woman stated. I don't remember Archie at all. The thread that ties us together, like the umbilical cord between a newborn baby and its mommy, has been severed. The hurt and all the memories associated with him seem to have fallen into the abyss of timelessness. Emily's mind was nothing but a viscous porridge that had had too much water poured into it when boiling. She fell asleep with her head barely touching the pillow. Earlier they had arranged with the cab driver, who had become her good wizard for the evening, that by 6 a.m. he would take her to the bus station for the first bus toward their village. It would be a full 4 hours on the highway to get home. Then, if she was lucky, a hitchhiker. Another half an hour on a dirt road to their village. The district administration promises that the road to their village will be asphalted. But they have been waiting 3 years for the promise. They have been living without a normal road for 30 years. That was the last thing Emily had time to think about before falling into a restful sleep. In the morning, the woman got up so cheerful that she surprised herself. Not a drop of despair after her son's treacherous stab in the back yesterday. Her soul was at peace. Yes, it was all on the doorstep of Archie's apartment. but it was as if the emotion had vanished. No grief, no sadness, no longing. A large cup of coffee and a fresh scone with cheese were waiting for her in the kitchen. One of the older women was carefully placing the same scones in a paper bag for her, gesturing that it was for the road. In her other hand, she held a clear plastic bag containing her jacket, shoved it embarrassedly into Emily's hands, and disappeared behind one of the doors. The cab driver from yesterday came up. "Well, Mother? Did you have some fun with my relatives?" "No. They don't speak Russian very well yet. It was my mother who taught Russian at school in the town of Kant in Uzbekistan. That's why I'm so quick to communicate. She died of a serious illness when she was very young. Since then, I want to help every woman who is old enough to be my mother in some way. I won't hurt the young ones either. Why should I? But I try to be especially attentive to the older ones. I didn't have time to give them everything I didn't give my mother. I missed it. Your son will regret what he did. Yesterday 100 times over. He and I are about the same age, but he hasn't matured into true manly wisdom. They'll come crawling back to you on their knees. You'll remember my words later, but now let's hurry or we'll miss your bus." After the blizzard of yesterday, the city was frozen in snow-white silence. There was hardly a soul on the streets. Only lonely passers-by were hurrying somewhere to go about their business. At such an early hour, it was not even dawn. The sky only turned a pink haze. After gathering her things, nothing else was weighing on her hands. Home to Mama Ellen's house. She missed their home and her mother's caressing hands terribly. Walking lightly to the bus with 2 small bags was almost a pleasure. Emily bought a ticket for the first row of seats and climbed into the bus, which was already under steam and waiting for passengers to see her off. The cab driver waved goodbye once more, and she was suddenly so eager to remember her first and only love that she barely waited until everyone else had taken their seats. No one had bought a ticket next to her. She cozied up in 2 seats at once and plunged into the memories of 30 years ago. The love story of each couple is different. One has fatal passion simmering. The other has a craving for romance off the charts. The third duo builds relationships, as in the tragedies of Shakespeare. If you try to characterize the love of Emily and Vincent in one word, then the most suitable definition is pure mutual love at first sight. He'd noticed her, the girl staring helplessly at the piece of glass sticking out of her hand. She heaved with happiness the moment there was a cracking sound as he tore his cotton shirt into bandages. Their worlds were different. He came from a family of hereditary medical intellectuals. She is the daughter of Matthew and Ellen, born and raised in poverty by the Russian soil and post-war collective farms. Their points of contact were few. But does love ask whose hands to weave together? After the day, Vince and Emily had spent all day setting tables side by side in the cafeteria for the students, and then laughing their asses off watching a comedy at the club. They were hardly different. Here's the revised text. It was as if they were glued to each other with glue. While Emily flew into the dining room with a tray in anticipation of her evening date, Vince carefully stacked the watermelons and melons in the truck, then hurried off, never lingering anywhere. People were running toward him. In their endless conversations, they sometimes got lost and misunderstood each other. Emily would tell how her parents ran to the farm at night. The calf could not come into the world, completely tortured the mother cow, and Vince would ask with a frothing at the mouth whether she had read The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. Vince's family has only had this great novel, printed in a limited edition in 1973, for 3 days. So he and his parents didn't eat or sleep for 3 days in order to have time to read the literary masterpiece. What Pontius Pilate? Who is Wooland? Who are the Master and Margarita? Emily thought fearfully. I am so far from all this new stuff. Gently he took the girl by the hand and led her away to a club for dancing, a movie, or just wandering around the neighborhood. Not a hint of intimacy, just endless admiration. A hive that could not be played. Time inexorably flew forward. The days flashed by. Soon the students had to leave for the city. Emily and Vince were oblivious to their surroundings, lost in the marvelous gift of heaven, their first true love. Neither of them had any previous experience with the opposite sex. Vince, contrary to his parents' dreams, was not going to follow the path of a doctor, but was delirious with formulas, integrals and derivatives, the mysteries of theoretical mathematics. That's why he entered a technical university, not a medical school after school. He was not fond of girls, neither at school nor on the student bench. Once at the age of 15, he seemed to fall in love with a girl next to him. But tricksy, quiet, intelligent classmate Attention did not complain. He wrote all the notes in class to the loser. She made eyes at him, waited faithfully for her idol after class on the sports field behind the school building. Vince's feelings waned. He's back to his sine qua non. Emily had more of his love lyrics in her life. Her faithful knight, henchman, admirer Greg had kept her busy since 5th grade. He pulled her thick braid mercilessly, demanded that she write her homework regularly. In the 8th grade, tried to kiss at the New Year's Eve party, but Amy guessed his intentions, prudently washed away from the school ball. As soon as Greg went outside to smoke with the boys, she was gone. Now Vince and Emily were lucky that the girl's boyfriend wasn't in the village. He had gone to the sea with his parents for 2 months. His mother, on occasion a cook, in the pioneer camp from the regional factory, got a job for the hot season. His father, mentor in the circle of skillful hands, there, too, got a job. But they had been on some kind of shift positions before. No one in the village was surprised by their absence this time. Emily's parents noticed that her daughter does not walk, but flies above the ground, but did not interfere in her personal life. The mother only told her daughter, "Be careful. These good city boys are of a different mold, not like our country boys, who have what's on their minds, what's in their actions. Don't be afraid for me, Mommy. He's the best. He won't even lay a finger on me. We talk more and more. Yeah, we look at the stars at night. Naive thoughts. Who could beat Mother Nature and instincts?" The last night before Vince left for home, he'd been so desperate to keep his hand in hers, so affectionate in Amy's eyes, that she couldn't understand what had come over her, what sweet eclipse had pushed her to do it. She rose up on her tiptoes and nestled her soft lips against Vince's, still smelling of the watermelon they'd just eaten together. The guy staggered back, wrapped his arms around the girl's shoulders, nuzzled his nose into the top of her head. "Fire me. Don't provoke me. I haven't touched you on purpose all this time, love. I'm afraid if I touch you, I won't be able to stop. And I have to leave tomorrow. Who knows what lies ahead?" And without stopping, Amy whispered into his ear, "It's my decision. I trust you completely." Vince hadn't expected such boldness. In his 19 years, he hadn't yet known women. But he'd curiously perused the theory in his parents' manuals a long time ago. There was not an ounce of awkwardness, fear of seeming like an inexperienced novice. Of course, he had long dreamed of intimacy with Amy, but he was afraid of offending her, and, in order not to lose his temper, deliberately did not even go to kisses, longer than on the cheek, to say goodbye, too dear to her, too careful of her honor, too respectful. There is such a reverent attitude to the object of his worship. Not all young men devise strategies and tactics to get their girlfriend into bed as quickly as possible. Back home, Vince intended to announce to his parents that he'd met the love of his life. This year he would travel to the village to visit Amy. Then she'd go to college and move closer to him in the city. When the time comes, they'll get married. The girl was too young to break her destiny. Love had decided everything for both of them. They couldn't resist, they couldn't delay. Amy had no regrets. Vince was over the moon. Later at night, after their shy, naive lovemaking, right in the field, amidst the flower buds swarming approvingly on a soft carpet of lush green grasses, they lay hugging each other for a long time, dreaming of the future. They would certainly have a family, certainly 3 children. They would have their own cozy nest somewhere in the city. And in the summer they would come to her parents in the village to be once again in the place where they were connected by this dark blue night, with twinkling distant stars. In the morning, a service bus came to pick up the students. They parted easily, with the firm assurance that the next weekend Vince would come to visit his beloved. Vince never arrived. He was gone. Amy hadn't realized that his parents were at home with suitcases, sharing the news. Son, we're so excited. Dad was appointed director of a huge surgery center in the Far East. It's a modern complex. All the equipment there is state-of-the-art. The best specialists from all over the country are gathered under its roof. It's a great privilege to work there. We've already learned everything. There's also a state university nearby with the same mechanical and mathematical faculty as yours. We're flying out the day after tomorrow. Vince turned pale. What are we going to do? We made a deal with Amy. Daily correspondence by mail for now. I left her my address and hers. I promised to write to her on demand. She'll freak out if I suddenly disappear. After dinner, Vince told his mother that he had met an extraordinary girl in the village, that he was in love with her, and that he missed her. The only thing he'd withheld was the fact that he and Amy were close. Having listened to the attuned offspring, the wise woman immediately solved his problem. Went to a neighbor in the stairwell, with whom she was very friendly, and agreed that all correspondence coming to their address, she will immediately send them to the Far East. When she returned, she told her son about the way out of the situation. I thought to myself, I will later return to this issue. If I realize that our boy is really seriously attracted to that stranger. Otherwise he will have new friends, fellow students, new interests, and new girls. Life itself will put everything in its place. All that happened in Vince's family more than 30 years ago, Amy, of course, did not know. She herself, before she could even see the boy off on the bus, had rushed straight home to try out her pen in epistolary style. Yesterday's schoolgirl was not very good at it. She was afraid to write something stupid, so she decided that she would tell her lover on paper how her every day was going. The first pancake is always a pancake. Amy found it very difficult to write a few lines. By the time she delivered it to the post office a day later in a brightly colored envelope with hearts on it, Vince and his parents were boarding a plane at the airport. 10 hours into the flight, the airliner landed at the airport. Petropavlovsk-Kamchatsky was almost a stone's throw away. They would find themselves on the Pacific coast, in Ivaka Bay, which prepared for them a picturesque land. Vince. The parents are a young man himself. Amy, Matthew, and Ellen could not even think that a gray cardinal would interfere in the fate of two hearts in love. Vince's neighbor from the family across the hall. The reason is mundane. But it is this small trifle managed to forever turn the fate of the two families, putting their lives on a completely different track. The fact is that the neighbor had a very young daughter who had long been in love with Vince. She had already tortured her mother with dreams that when she grew up, she would become Vince's fiancée, his wife. Her mother, who herself had raised the now 13-year-old girl without a father, looked at the family of successful doctors with a distant eye toward a future in breeding. It's nothing that they have now gone to Kamchatka for a long ruble. They left the apartment in her care. They didn't even rent it to anyone. She's been trying for years to placate, to please, to inspire trust, to bake a couple of hearty cabbage pies. One for the neighbor, the doctor's ears. That, with their eternal operations, duty when his family night masterpieces to pamper. Boil strawberry jam half of the jars again to the neighbor dear. She has a whole strawberry bushes on the dacha. Well, it is not difficult for her to share with nice people. So, offerings, good-naturedness, questions and participation and tamed the family of surgeons. She had no time to look into their souls. When she took out the first letter from Amy with bright red hearts on the envelope, she didn't send it anywhere. She hid it in a candy box. Let it wait for its time. The rest of the masterpieces in epistolary style from the girl in love also went there. For the first time, she dared to open a message when the hearts on it were black. Who had failed to do so? It had been 3 months since the neighbors had left for distant lands. Vince's mother pelted the neighbor with questions over the phone. Has anything come for your son? The wily woman held her ground. Anything that came in your name. I dutifully sent to you. Immediately nothing else appeared in your mailbox. Presently she held above the steam this last grim, as she called it to herself, envelope. The letter stirred. It contained only a couple of lines. Vince. I can't keep quiet any longer. I'm pregnant. I'm still keeping it from my parents. But if you don't answer my cry for help, I'm going to go tell them my problem. The mother of a teenage daughter in love, pining for Vince, could not help but destroy such a letter in favor of the love of the young man and his mysterious village girlfriend. Knowing the intelligence of this all-medical family, she had no doubt they would not abandon the girl who had gotten their son pregnant to her fate. Not one, even the smallest, remorse did not arise in the soul of the loving mother when she set the ill-fated letter on fire over the flame of the gas stove in the kitchen. It's all right that the paper burned her fingers a little. No wedding, Vince. With another special way bred and grief herself, and the consequences of her promiscuity. Ellen did not regard the fact of the love child's coming into the world as a nuisance or grief. She was still insanely credulous, ecstatically waiting for any word from Vince. She justified his silence in every way she could, invented 1,000 explanations for why her beloved had not yet responded to her letters. When there was no point in hiding her situation from her parents, Ellen told Matthew and Ellen the truth, that she had no regrets, that she loved Vince more than her life, that she had wanted them to be close. There was no scolding, no anger, no bewilderment on the part of her elders. Mama Ellen put her small but strong arms around her. She looked into her eyes and read something in them that she alone knew. Then she said, as she stamped each word, if your city beau has evaporated forever, it's here without him. Evil tongues in the village do not listen. Big, true love is not given to everyone by fate. People will envy your happiness, and a child from the one you love isn't that happiness, remember. My dear, if the heavens gave you a child after your close encounter, it means that your deed was approved by the Lord God himself. Look at the world with joyful eyes, give birth, and grandmother and I will always be there for you. The news that Helen would soon become a young mother could not be kept secret in the village for long. Greg, who had returned from the seas, was furious. He even tried to scandalize Ellen. Caught her in the street, so that's what girl did not give a horn. I turn away from the gate. And with the other had time to tumble. The impregnable fortress fell quickly. Or have you always been such a girl? And me just for fun? Ellen tried to walk past the guy throwing angry accusations, but he suddenly rushed to her and frantically began to beg, you don't listen to me. My jealousy has taken root. If it happens that your sweetheart doesn't come back to you, I'll marry you and we'll raise your baby together. Yugi was surprised by such a statement from her longtime admirer. Knowing his tough temper, she didn't believe a word he said. Vince alone held her feminine heart. Looking at Greg, the expression shameful became clear. Her heart grew cold at the sight of Greg. It became icy cold. She wanted to run away at once. She didn't tell the boy about the frost inside her. She thanked him dryly for his offer to be together, resolutely replied that it was impossible. That dialogue somehow became the last straw in her agonizing wait for Vince. It's a sad story of life's twists and turns and the mistakes of youth. When Yuji came home, a letter flew into town without any hearts on the envelope. Hello, Vince. Today I've decided to marry someone else. You are far away. He is always there. I don't see a future with you anymore. Goodbye, our love. I was probably just dreaming. Greg is reliable and faithful to me, which is something I value pricelessly in him. It wasn't Yugi's hand that was stroking the piece of paper. It was resentment, bitterness, and disappointment that whispered in her ear that she should write something derogatory, contemptuous, and cruel to her lover in retaliation. But Yugi still wouldn't sling mud, retaliate, reprimand. There's such an expression, not fate. She thought it was just such a case. The ubiquitous neighbor, who was assigned to send the mail, could not believe her luck. Thoughts fluttered around in her head like birds. The girl's heart couldn't take it. She still turned on the back, gave up Vince. And that's all me and my daughter want. This letter of hers I will send to the Far East with great pleasure. But her devious plans were not destined to come true. It is not for nothing that people talk about boomerangs. It caught up with her after that despicable act. In love with Vince, young lady in graduate school sharply changed priorities, fell into a bad company, fond of medicines. The mother of a classmate worked in a pharmacy. The boy, left there alone, began to understand the pills. And here the fashion went, and without a prescription they could get them. Alas, the mistakes of youth turned into a great tragedy for all participants in this story. What a pity that misunderstanding and intrigue separated two loving people. Their happiness was so close. Young people did not miss this opportunity. Once, betting on weakness, as I and the whole company decided to try a novelty. The guys drank the medicine in handfuls. Couldn't get the neighbor's daughter out of there. After the funeral, no consolation. The mother didn't last long. Why live if the only beloved blood daughter went to heaven prematurely, she thought. God was even more cruel to her, did not give her a quick demise, deprived her of reason. Only her nephew, the seventh water on the vine, remained among her relatives. Is he going to take care of an abnormal aunt, having registered guardianship over her? Quickly dumped a woman aged from grief in a specialized clinic, and rented the apartment to temporary tenants until then. Disassembling things in the house before the arrival of tenants, all the paraphernalia like old cardboard boxes and other unnecessary junk, he took to the trash cans. That's where the candy box with Vince's letters to Emily went, too. Now there's no trace of their once great love. The last evidence of the story had faded into oblivion. In early June, as it was due, Emily had a son. The family named the boy Archie. A sturdy, healthy, smiling, actively growing son, and gave cheek. Grandfather Matthew and grandmother Helen on the price of the soul did not tea. Mama Emily idolized the boy, and each of his features found a resemblance to his favorite. Childhood, like all the kids in the village fields and meadows with variety, vegetables and fruits in the garden and in the vegetable garden, favorite river with cool water, the animal world in all yards with cows, bird kingdom, frisky cats. Everyone tried not to even hint about Vince's daddy, realizing that his daughter's heart was still aching, and still washed at night with secret tears of her first love. Vince was welcomed at the University of Texas with open arms. His transcript was full of excellent grades. His knowledge was at a high level. Very soon he was able to dive back into his favorite formulas. At first he waited for letters from Emily with such greed and impatience that his father and mother even feared a little for his mental health. Then there was a period of supposed calm. Vince didn't ask about news from his hometown, and his parents avoided the subject. The letter was a verdict on the village affair, and Vince took it a little strangely. It was as if he'd been expecting something like this, ready for it. He didn't want to share the heartbreak with his parents. The energy was boiling, the frustration inside. He evaluated the events himself, but he didn't voice it. However, youth, new discoveries, new places, new acquaintances took their toll. Gradually, it began to seem to him that he had made it all up. A field with soft grass, the scents of flowers, the greedy lips of his beloved, the sparkle in her eyes. Maybe everyone's first experience leaves such vivid emotions. And in reality, everything was not so romantic. Somewhere in his heart there were echoes of memories, and then they faded into a dreamlike haze, like a fairy tale set against the backdrop of the countryside. Vince had given himself fully to science and had excelled in it. Even before he graduated, a prestigious foreign magazine published a small monograph on the application of certain mathematical formulas to industry. The graduate student mastered the English language perfectly unthinkable for the mid-90s in Russia. The young mathematician was seriously interested in Great Britain and the USA. A year after defending his diploma, Vincent was offered a long internship at an American university. After consulting with his parents, he agreed. On the personal front, the technician-mathematician, who showed great promise, was not at all a reclusive monk. He had affairs with fellow students, did not ignore sparkling parties, easily made unburdensome connections with women. His heart was silent, and sometimes he couldn't even remember their names. Vince traveled to the United States alone, and there he suddenly fell in love. His romance with Maggie, a bright brunette wife from Florida who studied psychology at the same university where he was assigned to lecture, was like a tsunami, a typhoon, a love whirlwind, a tornado. When Vince was offered a contract for another 5 years, he accepted enthusiastically. Maggie finished her studies and finally moved in with him on campus, where he was assigned an office cottage with a large emerald lawn at the entrance and a swimming pool in the backyard. Maggie had only one major disadvantage for health reasons: she couldn't have children. That had bothered Vince at first, but then he'd come to terms with it. He loved the woman with a strange, morbid affection. After the modest wedding, little had changed in their union. Vincent still worked night and day on his mathematics. His wife chose to become a housewife. After his successful university work and marriage, Vince became a resident of this Western country. He had not been to Russia for many years. Modern gadgets now allowed him to communicate with the sight of his relatives on a large computer screen. His restless parents wouldn't part with medicine for an hour, even to visit him and his daughter-in-law. Vince and Maggie traveled extensively on the rare days they were free from work. His royalties were getting larger and larger on the basis of the unusual developments he had made. There was already much being implemented in industrial sectors and even in the space field. The essence of his work was so complex that only specialists understood it, and Vince couldn't stop working on new problems. If he had been asked what his life in America was like, he would have said, without hesitation, that it was happy and serene. It seemed that this prosperous era would be endless. But to whom does fate allocate only white joyful stripes? The black ink of sorrow spilled onto the whiteness. After 17 years of happy married life, Maggie unexpectedly fell in love with a young scientist-physicist who arrived, as her husband once arrived in the United States from Latin America for training. The man was unusually good-looking, a fiery mixture of southern blood, penetrating eyes, inquisitive gaze, luxurious curly hair. There was something of blue-blooded aristocrat and macho in his appearance at the same time. He wore his clothes with such elegance on his athletic figure that one could guess the graceful movements of a strong leopard. The female students in his lectures heard nothing of what he was trying to teach them, but only watched him like a hypnotist and a boa constrictor. Jinnah and the newly arrived scientist first crossed paths at a Thanksgiving party. November was chilly that year. The woman, all the while wrapped in a fashionable fur jacket over her evening gown, was saving herself with another shot of whiskey to keep warm. She picked up the glass with the hot drink and reached for the tongs to add ice to the drink. It was at that moment that she encountered the burning eyes of a dark-haired man with striking good looks. They say love is chemistry. The molecules of two bodies and souls collide in the air. Some catalyst intervenes and it's done. That's what happened for Maggie and her new object of attention. They left the party together. The woman didn't care what her husband thought about it. Maggie did not hide the protracted love affair, which became a rope between the two hearts, from Vincent. "I don't care what happens tomorrow, darling. Today I'm madly in love and also madly happy. You don't deserve deception on my part, so I'm saying all of this to your face. Accept it and forgive me. It just happened," she said succinctly. Vince listened to his wife calmly. He had already guessed what was going on and was unsurprised by his reaction. The painful agony of the beginning of their relationship was gone. By and large, he did not care where and with whom his wife spends time. Their love had exhausted itself. Even the warmth was almost gone, just a tribute to the years they had spent together. Nothing more. He suddenly had a sudden urge to leave everything in this distant country, which had never really become his native country, and return to Russia to his parents. But the laws did not allow him to disappear overnight after his divorce from his wife. He was still bound by certain obligations with the university. Some scientific developments continued, and lectures went on as usual. It was necessary to solve issues with real estate and other property, earned over years of hard work as a specialist of his level. The government and the company he worked for paid generously. Vince had amassed a considerable amount of capital that could help him start from scratch back home. It took him 2 seemingly endless years to resolve all the legal issues. Of course, during his stay there, he went to Russia several times to see his parents in person, but he never traveled further than the Far East. Now he wanted to travel to the places of his childhood, youth, and student years. The plans were grandiose. And then there was a meeting with his classmates in his hometown. He really wanted to take an active part in it. Archie's New Year's Eve romance, which had almost been ruined by his mother's sudden arrival with suitcases, had been a stormy and memorable one. Mandy was amazing. She had only one drawback: she was constantly, like a powerful vacuum cleaner, pulling out all of Archie's earnings. After a couple of months, it became clear that not only salaries and advances, but also rainy day reserves were flying into the wind. And Mandy kept saying, "Kitty, you're so cool. Buy me that purse that drove me crazy at the mall." Her mistress didn't want to do any of the housework. They ordered food from restaurants all the time. Cleaning the apartment once a week had to be done by a cleaning company. Inside, Archie began to grow a deafening irritation. But it was not so easy to get rid of the mistress who loved broad gestures. By the May holidays, she broke the news to him that she was pregnant. She talked about a stamp in the passport, a fashionable wedding dress from the latest collection, and necessarily diamonds and small ears, so that all her friends collapsed from envy. Marriage wasn't exactly in Archie's plans. He was visibly successful. At this time, his companion was sitting with her friends at the bar and sharing her plans for the near future. "Girls, another sucker has fallen for my bait. I have already told him the fairy tale that we will have a child. Now he's looking for a way out, and I have the next trump card up my sleeve. I'll tell him I'm ready to get rid of the baby. How would he know that after the first abortion I probably won't have children? And I'm a child-free person myself. I don't need cute babies screaming in diapers." "Aren't you afraid that one of your men will figure out your pregnancy adventure?" one of her friends asked, stirring her cocktail with a bright red plastic straw. "What are you talking about?" the experienced schemer grinned. Most modern men are so afraid of the legal marriage stamp in their passports that they rush to count the payoffs for their freedom. Archie, meanwhile, was running through his head a combination of how to pull off a deal on behalf of his company and get a big kickback for services from the suppliers. He had no experience with commercial subterfuge. But that was okay, he could handle it. The main thing is that the preparation of this contract was entrusted to him. There was one thing the man hadn't considered. His boss was a clever businessman. He noticed the greedy gleam in his subordinate's eyes when talking about a new equipment purchase. So he instructed the security service to follow Archie in all his movements. A week later on his desk was a full report on the unbridled appetites of Mandy, who also worked in the same firm. Experienced servicemen through her friends also got to know about the scam she had planned. They even knew that Archie had already accepted the terms of separation from his mistress. Even crossed himself mentally Lord, let him go to all four sides. What marriage? What children? From all this only unnecessary troubles appear. The company decided to catch Archie red-handed at the moment of his meeting with the machine manufacturers. So the two sides hit it off. The reward envelope is already in Archie's hands. It's time for a different scenario. Considering that this was the first attempt of the employee to pocket the fee for the deal in order to purchase not the best quality equipment, the chief fired Archie without severance pay. A rumor was immediately started following the man unreliable specialists are not recommended to hire him. All of Emily's aspirations and endeavors went down the social garbage chute. How many lessons she once gave her boy, how many times before entering the technical university she took him to tutors in the city so that he could pass exams with high scores and enter the budget. The unified state exams were then introduced in the region as a trial experiment. Neither teachers nor students knew yet how this system would work. But he and Archie succeeded. How much later, in her student years, she fed, drank, clothed him? Would a young man be able to live on a paltry scholarship with his already then considerable demands? And it was their habit all summer to prepare supplies for the winter, to then solemnly hand the tasty gifts to their son. It had been 6 months now, and Emily still couldn't understand what had made Archie kick her out of the house in a blizzard. But she didn't want to find out what he was up to. She and her mother were still screwing jars of pickles and jam together this summer under long conversations, and they were still so fond of each other. They had no idea that Archie, long since separated from Maggie, was now living on casual labor. He was addicted to cheap hard liquor brought from unknown sources to the convenience store around the corner. His mother was unaware that now he would consider it a blessing to boil those homemade potatoes and snack on vodka with his mother's crunchy cucumber. Sometimes he had the impulse to go to the village and apologize, but his pride was not all drowned in the swamp of degrees. Here he will find a permanent job, he will rub everyone's nose in it, and then he will appear as a queen in his small homeland. The 30th anniversary of his graduation had been a very heartwarming occasion. Vincent didn't expect his classmates to follow his academic progress and be proud of him. The city of his childhood and youth had welcomed him very warmly in general. It hadn't changed much. Everything was native and familiar. After hearing about the tragic events in the family of his former neighbors in the stairwell, Vincent thought, I wish I knew how my life would have turned out if my father had not been assigned to that new surgical center in the Far East. Some annoying worm in his soul began to nudge him go to that village where you met your first love. No one is obliging you to anything, but don't you yourself want to put an end to that long-ago story? Hiring an automobile, still a novelty in this region, he set off. This western manner had always been to his liking. He vaguely remembered the name of the village where he had once harvested watermelons and melons in the melons fields, but that didn't bother him at all. He remembered the approximate route. He got there quickly on the highway, but when he turned onto a dirt road, he grinned to himself. Some things haven't changed a bit in more than 30 years. He was caught up by a UA's truck running on all sides, and Vincent, who had just stopped for a snack before it got dark, raised his hand to ask the driver to stop. Good people, good evening, he greeted the middle-aged man. Can you tell me how far it is to the village? I haven't been in your neighborhood for very many years. The owner of the Uazik looked around the foreigner curiously, at his appearance a gentleman in an expensive jacket and new jeans. Are you going to visit someone? Or so, driving around the neighborhood for idle curiosity, he asked. I'm looking for some people I know, Uncle Matthew and Aunt Ellen's family. They had a daughter, Emily, Vincent answered honestly, deciding not to be sarcastic. They do, the man nodded. Only the head of the family has been dead for about 7 years. The rest of them are alive and well. Vincent's breath caught in the excitement, and he could barely move his tongue. Emily and her husband are separated, aren't they? Family, kids. Emily has a son, the man replied. After hearing about the tragic events in the family of his former stairwell neighbors, Vincent thought, I wonder how my life would have turned out if my father hadn't been assigned to that new surgical center in the Far East. Some annoying worm in his soul began to nudge him, go to that village where you met your first love. No one is obliging you to anything. But don't you yourself want to put an end to that long ago story? Hiring an automobile. Still a novelty in this region, he set off. This western manner had always been to his liking. He vaguely remembered the name of the village where he had once harvested watermelons and melons in the melon fields, but that didn't bother him at all. He remembered the approximate route. He got there quickly on the highway, but when he turned onto a dirt road, he grinned to himself. Some things haven't changed a bit in more than 30 years. He was caught up by a UA's truck running on all sides, and Vincent, who had just stopped for a snack before it got dark, raised his hand to ask the driver to stop. Good people, good evening, he greeted the middle-aged man. Can you tell me how far it is to the village? I haven't been in your neighborhood for very many years. The owner of the Uwazik looked around the foreigner curiously at his appearance, a gentleman in an expensive jacket and new jeans. Are you going to visit someone? Or so, driving around the neighborhood for idle curiosity, he asked. I'm looking for some people I know, Uncle Matthew and Aunt Ellen's family. They had a daughter, Emily. Vincent answered honestly, deciding not to be sarcastic. They do, the man nodded. Only the head of the family has been dead for about 7 years. The others are alive and well. There's a big brat. I even took her to him to town last winter on New Year's Eve. She's never been married. She gave birth to a boy 30 years ago to a student, but he left her when she was pregnant. She's been alone ever since. I asked to see her, but she refused. But I'm a little more than that with you, Yuji, said the man. Greg looked suspiciously at the colorful man, jumped into his UAZ and drove off across the field. Vince stood in the middle of the road in complete confusion. Then, just as quickly, he climbed into the car, unable to wait any longer. Now he would find his first love, his first woman, and what would be will be. In the village, he found the old cottage of Ellen's family. No hesitation. It's dark. Behind the pattern of this curtain, a bright light burned in the hut. The muffled sound of a television could be heard from the open window. He walked from the gate to the porch on trembling legs, climbed the 3 steps and knocked on the door. Behind it came brisk footsteps and a woman's whisper. Emily, look who it is. You've come to see us at night. Emily threw a warm shawl around her shoulders. She had just bathed her mother and was dressing her in clean clothes. She had just bathed her mother and was dressing her in clean clothes as she dressed her. She looked at the guest silently from head to toe and said a phrase that made Vince's heart sink. I knew you'd come back. Every love story may or may not have a sequel. Some endings are like a fairy tale, as happened in this marvelous novel. Listening to the story of Vince and Emily's love story, there's so much irony. You'd think some writer was feeding us fables. It doesn't happen in real life. But it did happen. Emily's wise woman's heart did not set up a judgment on the actions of the man she loved. Sensible masculine heart of Vincent immediately prioritized with mathematical precision, scattered the answers to the tasks at hand. Neither of them knew where the girl's letters had disappeared to. Some evil force had played out for them this sad play of long separation, where they had the lead roles. Archie, who had been working as a loader in a regular store for the 2nd year, decided to go to a beer bar after his shift to relax a little. Lately, he had stopped with stronger drinks, as he began to ruin his liver. Had enough sense to tone it down a bit. The man at the far table seemed vaguely familiar to him. Grabbing a mug with a still foamy cap and a plate of dried shrimp, he headed over to keep him company. Greg. It was him, having settled all his business, stopping at the first bar he could find to grab a bite to eat. He didn't recognize Archie as the unkempt, bearded man who plumped himself on the stool opposite him. Isn't there any other tables around? He asked his uninvited neighbor with hostility. Don't you recognize me, Uncle Greg? It's me, Archie, We're from the same village." It was only now that Greg realized that the drunken man looked remotely like Emily's son. Only lower and older, but still he was recognizable. "How's life with you?" "My grandmother's still alive and my mom's still working on her pickles." Archie tried to stretch his face into a wry smile, but his mood suddenly soured. Why did he even sit down with his fellow countrymen? It seemed that he had once been in love with his mother, and now he was going to start teaching him about life again. But Greg grinned good-naturedly and answered, "The whole village is praying for your mother. We have a new road with excellent asphalt. Her husband organized everything and paid the expenses. My grandmother was taken to the Far East to a surgical center and was treated a little. She hasn't become active, but she can move around quite well with a stick. And your parents have built such a nice house next to the old house. It's a sight to behold." Archie thought he'd misheard. Why did Uncle Greg say parents and not one mother? It was as if he'd overheard his thoughts. The countryman went on with his story. Archie's parents had a beautiful love story. 30 years later, they were reunited again. Everyone in the village used to think that such things only happened in books and movies. No, I witnessed for myself that a woman's love is strong, strong and faithful. She waited. This story warmed my soul, gave me hope that even at their age, happiness is still possible. Come on, brother, I still have to get home. Shall I say hello to your mother? Or would you deign to show up at their house yourself? I'll take care of it, Archie grumbled. His mood had fallen, along with his ego. The bus pulled away from the bus stop near the village. The driver looked back at the passenger compartment. There was only some vague-looking man getting out, moving his lips all the way, as if he were practicing a speech. Archie was really working hard to find the words he would say to his mother to apologize. But everything that came into his head seemed empty and insignificant. Love for one's family is in actions, not words. Could he earn forgiveness from his parents? The man crept quietly to the ajar gate and peered through the opening. Workers were laboring in the yard near the old house. A picturesque log house of 2 stories stood out next to the construction site. It immediately reminded Archie of some fairy tale log cabin, where Santa Claus, forest gnomes, or some other magical characters could live. Everything around breathed coziness, some special domestic charm. His mother walked through the yard in an embrace with a gray-haired man. "Yes, it's going to be a great bath. Don't worry," Maggie the man said. "Ellen's mother will be back from her treatment soon. It'll be a nice surprise for her." He kissed the woman on the top of her head and hurried off to the workers to give them new orders. Emily returned to the gazebo, where the electric kettle was already boiling. A jar of Archie's favorite apricot jam and vases of cookies stood on the table. He pushed the wicket gently open and stepped forward, mentally vowing to himself that he would do everything he could to make his family forgive him and welcome him back into their home. If necessary, he would start his journey again from scratch, from the basics. He now knows exactly what things rule this world. Someday he will teach these truths to his children. "Mommy, look what a boat Grandpa made for me," Vivian exclaimed as soon as she saw it. It was early spring outside. The snow had just begun to melt, but all the puddles had already turned into streams, around which the children were running merrily, shouting and laughing. Everyone had paper boats, and some of them had real wooden boats made by their fathers or grandfathers on the weekend. Near a large tree, from which large drops of melting snow were falling, stood a girl of 8, tall for her age. She looked longingly in front of her. She didn't have a boat. Her mom was at work, so she couldn't make one. And the girl had no one else, not even friends. They had recently moved to a new house, and she had not yet had time to get acquainted with anyone, but she liked to go out. But it was hard to have fun when everyone was playing and laughing and no one wanted you. Lily sighed and pouted her lips in resentment. On a bench a little away from the brooks and trees sat a short old man with gray tangled hair and a gray-brown cotton jacket. On his feet were very shabby boots that must have been cold. He looked at the children with a smile, then shifted his gaze to the girl and lowered his head sadly. After a few seconds, some idea occurred to the old man. He jumped up from the bench and ran somewhere towards the house. He knocked on the door. A rather tall woman came out on the porch with a vacuum cleaner in her hands. She asked the old man something menacingly, But when he explained what he wanted, she nodded her head and went into the house. A few seconds later, she returned with a piece of paper. The old man nodded gratefully and returned to his bench. He began to fold the paper into something that looked like a ship. He did it in a very unusual way, in his own way, and even managed to attract the girl's attention. It should be recognized that this old man was one of those who, with his kindness and charm, could make people to himself. He was helped by everyone to whom he turned for help. Either he managed to pity them, or he was able to choose those who were able to sympathize. Nobody knew such people who would not refuse help. But everyone helped, and he never said no when he was asked. Maggie Swan, who lived in a house on the edge of the street, was an old and feeble old woman. She was so weak that sometimes she couldn't carry heavy bags home. Stephen, the old man, was always there to help. Maggie Swan often brought cutlets or soup to his home, an abandoned schoolhouse. Lillian watched the old man with interest as he folded the ship. When he finally finished, he smiled kindly at the girl and beckoned her over to him. Lillian's mom always told her not to go near strangers because they could hurt her, or take her away from her mom. And Lillian had always obeyed her mother's command. But not now. The old man's good-natured smile, curiosity, and desire to play with everyone made her go to the bench. The old man silently handed the girl a small snow-white ship made of thick paper, almost cardboard. It was unusual, not like the others, big, with sails and masts. Lillian did not know that such a thing could be made from an ordinary sheet of paper. Her eyes lit up, and she looked at the old man, as if he were a wizard from a fairy tale she had recently read. The old man nodded at the creek where the children were playing and smiled again. The smile lit up Lillian's face. She ran to play with the others, as if this ship was a ticket to a world of friendship and children's games. Contrary to her wish, the girl did not put the ship on the water and began to feel sorry for it. She ran with the boys, refused to exchange with the boys who offered their crafts. What Lillian got was attention and a desire to play with her. She didn't need anything else. She turned to see that old man again, but he wasn't there. The bench was empty. Lillian looked sadly at the ship and ran home. She would be sure to keep it. No other way, for it was a gift from a real wizard. At home, Lily waited impatiently for her mother. She had to come home from work in the evening, about 5 o'clock. The girl was so impatient to tell about the ship that she forgot to eat and did not even turn on her favorite cartoons, which were only on Saturdays and only at this time. She kept running to the window to see her mother's red coat or her blue beret. But Mom was lingering somewhere. When the hand of the clock passed 5, Lily began to worry. She didn't move away from the window anymore. Tears almost came to her eyes. What if Mommy, like Daddy once, didn't come? The girl was afraid that it would happen again. But fortunately, this time her fears were in vain. Lily's mom, Vivian, came half an hour after the promised time. Lily threw herself on her neck, not even allowing her to put the bags on the floor. "What's wrong?" Vivian exclaimed. "I thought you weren't coming as Daddy," almost sobbed the girl. Sweet Vivian hugged her daughter and squatted down. Lily, like most children, was often dramatic, but it was enough to caress her, and her resentments usually ended after a series of favorite cartoons, or after a batch of ice cream bought especially for her. Now she wiped away her tears with her sleeve and smiled broadly. "Look what I have," shouted the girl and ran off to her room. Vivian smiled and shook her head, trying to get her boots off before her daughter arrived. Lily came running in just a few seconds later and held out a snow-white ship to her mother. Vivian took it in her hands and bowed her head. She examined it closely and came across a faded, barely legible inscription. The woman aghast and drew back, not knowing what to say. "Honey, where did you get it?" The old man on the bench, Lily shrugged. "He made it for me." "What did he look like?" Lily wondered. She wasn't good at describing people, so she could only name clothes. Vivian handed her daughter the grocery bags and asked her to sort through them, and went to her room. She sat down tiredly on her bed and sighed. The woman couldn't believe her eyes and still thought she had only imagined it. Vivian reached into her locker and pulled out an old shoebox from there. She carefully removed the lid with trembling fingers and exhaled noisily. Rarely did she have to open this cherished box. For years, it had been filled with old trinkets that anyone else would have called junk when they opened a shoebox. But for Vivian, it was the only thing that connected her to her parents. Or rather, so she thought. Vivian Laurel's mom was indeed dead. She had died of cancer when the girl was 13. Her father, on the other hand, had gone missing 3 years earlier. At the age of 13, Vivian was left alone. The boon of her upbringing was taken by an aunt, her father's sister, Helen. She was younger than her brother, unmarried, and belonged to the type of people who believed that nothing could be better than freedom. So she never restricted her niece in anything. However, her upbringing, too. She was not particularly engaged, preferring to write memoirs, go to modeling shoots and celebrate contracts with her many lovers, which she had at least 6 for the time that Vivian lived with her. Except the last one had lingered for 2 years with her son Damien. Ellen had never treated her niece with warmth or anything of the sort. She simply didn't care for the girl. At times she would walk into her room, look at Vivian aloofly, nod her thoughts, and leave. At the age of 18, she subtly began to hint that it was time for her niece to do the honors, and that she was too busy in someone else's house. From then on, Vivian started living on her own. She had been working part-time before, saving money for the future, and now she began to live on her own. 16 years ago, a 13-year-old girl named Vivian sat on a narrow bed with flowered sheets. She was holding a ship made of paper. It had a mast and sails, and was not like the ones the children played with on the street. The girl's face was streaked with tears. She looked sadly at the ship. Her hand trembled. "And what did you get me wrong with this toy?" "Aren't you 5 years old?" Rolling her eyes, she asked Ellen, who leaned against the door and looked at her niece. She was a tall, thin woman with long curly hair and a very pretty face. The woman preferred to wear expensive brand-name clothes and wore good makeup. As a child, Vivian often heard from her mother that she didn't know where she got the money for all this, because Ellen never had a proper job. Once in a while, she sold her graphomaniacal writings to publishing houses and received modest money for photo shoots as a model. "Daddy made this for me," the girl replied, coping with her emotions, and hid the ship in a small shoebox that stood beside her. When the lid was in place, Vivian clutched the box to her chest. "Your father has been gone for 3 years. No? There's no telling where he is," Ellen shrugged. "It's about time you started living your own life. Your mother wasn't very good at it, though." Vivian looked at her aunt with hatred and clenched her teeth. A storm of emotions rose up in her over the mention of her mother in such a negative way. The girl understood that she should not quarrel with her aunt, with whom she would have to live for a long time. But she was not going to listen to such statements about her mother. "It's a memory of him. Only he made ships like this. I know, because no one else had them. He used to leave his signature by folding the sheet in a special way. Would you like me to show you?" Ellen held up her hands, shook her head. Looking at old paper always made me ache. When he had nothing else to do, he also stuck it to others. The look Vivian gave her aunt frightened the woman. She opted to remove herself from the small room, leaving the girl alone with her thoughts. There could be no mistake. It was indeed the same ship. The same illegible letters were folded and stamped on the side as on the old, yellowed pieces of paper. Vivian folded the 2 ships and closed her eyes. "What if I'm just making this up to myself?" The woman shook her head. Nothing had been heard from her father in over 19 years. It was as if he had fallen through the earth. And now, after all this time, Vivian sees the same ship. What if it was just a coincidence? But she didn't believe in coincidence. Vivian believed in fate. Maybe it was her desire to have at least one loving relative. Except for her daughter, of course. But she was too young to confide her worries to her. Vivian had never been an optimist. Quite the opposite. Life didn't give her moments to believe in miracles or happy endings. First her father disappeared, then her mother died. A self-obsessed aunt became her guardian. At 19, it seemed that life was finally starting to get better. When the young girl was in law school, she got a boyfriend and they started living together. It seemed then that it would always be good. But fate never left Vivian. They just gave her a little respite. And then years later, there was grief in her life again. The usual, ordinary grief. The woman was glad to have her daughter, but she was very afraid for her. In essence, Lily was all Vivian had left. and the tiny chance that her father was still alive lit a faint flame in the long-lost woman's soul. "Lily," Vivian shouted, putting the box away. She had never shown it to anyone since that day at Ellen's house. It seemed to be something private and intimate, something to be hidden and given to no one. "Honey, come here." Lily ran into the room. Her face was smeared with flour. It certainly didn't escape her mother's attentive gaze. Vivian looked at her daughter with that maternal look that made it impossible to lie. Lowering her eyes, Lillian confessed. "I dropped the flour. The whole packet. I meant to make cheesecakes this morning, but I remembered too late. I thought I'd have it cleaned up before you got here." "Kids," Vivian thought and shook her head. For a second, the heavy thoughts were gone from her head, and she looked at her daughter with a smile. Lily was the only ray of light in her life, and she wasn't ready to lose it. "Okay, we'll deal with the flour," Vivian said. "You'd better tell me, where was the old man who made you the boat?" Lillian sighed and tried to explain the place. Vivian had grown up in this town, so she knew the streets and nooks and crannies very well. However, even she had a hard time figuring out the location from her daughter's clumsy and slightly awkward description. "The garages are near the village?" Vivian shrieked when she finally understood. Lillian shrugged her shoulders. "If it's not them, I've completely forgotten the town." Lily didn't understand half of her mother's words, so she just nodded and pulled her by the hand into the kitchen. "Come on, I'm hungry." "Oh, you'll be hungry all day. I want rice with a cutlet." The girl nodded and rushed into the kitchen. "But first, let's remove the flour." Vivian grinned. A heavy sigh sounded on a cool spring street near a small village. It wasn't really a village, but a part of the city where private houses were still standing. When the center and most of the districts were given for the construction of high-rise buildings, the inhabitants of this part of the city refused, and there remained a settlement of private houses. It was quite small, but because of the heavy car traffic and the large number of plantations, it was sought after by teenagers in the evenings and children during the day. Vivian had no idea how her 18-year-old daughter had found this settlement, if it was far enough away from their apartment. Instead, the woman was greeted by the familiar fresh air and a view that hadn't changed at all. It was worth saying, the settlement hadn't changed in the 10 years she'd been out of town. Unlike the town, where new stores, buildings, schools, and kindergartens had sprung up, here stood the old grocery store, where a tall, full-figured Nellie, who never wore a blue apron, probably still worked. Vivian and her friends often ran behind the garages or sat in the village's cowering playground. Besides, there were lots of abandoned houses here, a teenager's paradise. There were streams and puddles everywhere. But Vivian remembered the way to the garages. She knew she wasn't likely to find anything there, but it was worth a try. Then she intended to ask around. In a place like this, everybody knows everybody. Really, Vivian grinned. The garages hadn't changed at all, except that they were a little dimmer than they had been 10 years ago. They still stood close together. In the middle was a beaten path where teenagers ran around, and one garage had an old 9-wheeler on it. No one knew how it had gotten there, but it had been there since before Vivian had moved in with her aunt. Out of the corner of her eye, she could see the bench where the old man had been sitting, according to Lillian's story. And a little farther away stood an old, centuries-old oak tree, its branches spreading out for many meters. There stood the girl. Vivian looked around more carefully, hoping to find some hint of the old man who had made the boat. "Girl, you shouldn't stand where the cars go," a loud, very sonorous male voice sounded behind her. Vivian turned indignantly toward the man and opened her mouth to say what she thought, but she failed. "Damien, are you okay?" she said. In front of the woman stood her longtime and not the most pleasant acquaintance. He was the type of memory that you didn't really want to remember. Tall, blonde-haired, and very much like her. Oh gods, how badly did Vivian want him gone, disappear, like her father had once been, without a trace. That was her ultimate dream at 16, the woman thought. To meet him now was a complete surprise to her. "I live here." "How you ended up here is the question," the man grinned. Damien was a year older than Vivian, but he was in the same grade as her. Due to a lot of moving around by his father, who was in the military, he changed schools often. A year after Laurel, Vivian's mom, died, Ellen got together with Damien's dad and the boy moved in with them. Or rather, he moved in with Vivian, for he shared a room with her for the next 2.5 years. It was a terrible 2.5 years. Vivian preferred never to remember them. 13 years ago, a tall, blonde-haired boy had flown into the room and thrown his backpack right onto the floor. The backpack was light. There were hardly any textbooks in it, but it hit the leg of a girl who was sitting at her desk trying to do her homework. It's worth saying, Vivian had always studied hard, trying to get good grades. But lately, because of the presence of an uninvited neighbor, she had fallen behind in her studies. So she had to do her homework when no one was in the apartment. Luckily, Damien liked to hang out after school with his buddies. "How many times do I have to tell you not to throw things in the room?" the girl asked angrily, not turning around. She had already started looking for her old headphones to isolate herself from Damien's chatter. Yes, it was his favorite thing to talk. While Vivian did her homework, he pestered her constantly. "This is my room too, Prickles. And you should stop worrying about order like this apartment is yours," Damien said. Vivian couldn't take it anymore and turned to face the guy. "You know, it doesn't matter where you are. Throwing things on the floor, talking loudly all night is unacceptable anywhere," she replied. Damien grinned and tossed the tattered tennis ball from one hand to the other. "You're too right, baby girl. We're only 9 months apart," the girl muttered resentfully and went back to her algebra homework. The headphones were finally plugged in, and Vivian could no longer hear Damien's annoying, mosquito-like voice. Not long after that day, Vivian lost her headphones. More correctly, Damien had ruined them, fed up with her ignoring his words. Then Vivian even cried. And now, many years later, she stood in the garages and looked at that same annoying and nasty face. Of course, they were no longer children, and Vivian herself had long since become a mother. But childish resentments don't just go away. That was why she felt a nasty suffocation in her soul, as if there had been an encounter she did not want. However, despite her feelings, Vivian smiled. "I recently moved here," she said. Damien shifted his gloves into another pocket and grinned. "I thought you had an apartment in Springfield, didn't you?" "I sold it," Vivian answered briefly. "And no, I don't want to talk about what happened." The man grinned. The familiar dimples appeared on his face. He was standing quite far away, but even from that distance Vivian could see the familiar light in his eyes. "Do you want to come in?" "I don't live far from here," Damien asked. "Or do you have something to do?" "Next time I will. Right now I've got 44 minutes before my shift starts. And I still have to find the homeless guy the 8-year-old kid described." Damien's eyes widened. He looked at the woman in surprise and grinned again. He didn't seem to understand anything, but he was insanely curious about the homeless man. Vivian didn't know if she should answer Damien, since she never liked him and only did nasty things to him. But sensibly, she briefly described the situation. She realized that it would be very difficult to find the old man without local help. Besides, Damien, like her, was a grown man. It would be foolish to ruin a chance to find a possible father because of a childhood grudge. "So you're looking for the man who made your daughter's boat?" Damien clarified. "I won't ask why you're looking, but I can't help you yet. I just bought a garage here. I don't know anything or anyone yet. But I'll be sure to ask around. Maybe someone can tell me something." Vivian nodded gratefully. She hadn't expected to be so lucky. It was the first time fate had taken pity on her. Given that it was Damien, though. "Give me the number," he said. Vivian looked at him blankly. "I'll call you if I find anything." "Or do you want me to pigeonhole the answer?" Damien snickered. "No," Vivian mumbled. There he was, the real Damien, sarcastic and sarcastic. "Too bad," the man smiled wryly. "I would have had to get your address." Vivian held back the urge to reply and handed Damien a business card. He took it and whistled. "Juvenile Inspector, Senior Lieutenant Adams, Vivian. Not bad. I never thought you'd be on the police force." "In Springfield, I was a specialist in another field, and here they just hired me to raise kids. "I never thought I'd be doing that," Vivian replied. "I didn't see myself as a schoolteacher either," the man chuckled and punched the number into his phone. Vivian's eyes went wide. "What? No way. You were dumb as a cork. How could I be?" Damien rolled his eyes and shook his head. 13 years later, and you're still so self-righteous and self-important." "Who's to say?" Vivian snorted. "All right, well, if you hear anything, give me a call." She hurriedly left without saying goodbye. The thoughts and feelings of childhood returned. Someone will probably say it's strange that they're almost 30 years old. What childish resentments. But for Vivian, immersed in her own problems after the death of her mother and the disappearance of her father, it was the last straw. A drinking aunt, a strange man in the apartment, and a man who took her room and made her worry almost every day. She almost lost her gold medal because of him, and had a fight with her aunt so bad that she threatened to get rid of her niece. It wasn't just a childish grudge, it was something that couldn't be forgotten. "Baby, stay with Aunt Stacy. She'll look after you," Vivian whispered quietly in her daughter's ear. "But where are you going so late?" Vivian sighed. She couldn't tell her daughter the truth. "I was called for work," she replied. Lilia nodded and hugged her mother. "Aunt Stacy, I'll pick her up in the morning then, so I don't wake you up, okay?" Vivian said to her tall, thin neighbor. Stacy nodded. It wasn't the first time she'd stayed with a girl whose mother worked all the time. There were a lot of downsides to raising a child alone. Vivian left Stacy's apartment and went about her business. She got into the old car that had once belonged to her husband and drove off. At 12:30 at night, the bell rang. On the other side was Damien's slightly agitated voice, asking to come urgently to the abandoned school building. Vivian was angry. She just didn't understand what he wanted from her at almost midnight. But he was asking to come urgently. So she sent her daughter to a neighbor's house and set off towards the school building herself, remembering where it was. Night roads were a nightmare for the woman. She hated driving anywhere in the dark. The fear left over from the accident constantly rattled her. But the odd joking text messages Damien sent kept Vivian driving on. She just wanted to remember a couple of self-defense techniques and smash his smug nose in his face for upsetting her daughter and making Vivian herself drive at midnight to an unknown destination. Oh, how angry she was. But there was nothing she could do. She just gripped the steering wheel and read the dumb jokes and Damien's messages out of the corner of her eye. Vivian wouldn't be surprised if she arrived at the building and he was waiting for her with a smile and said he was just bored. The car had to be parked far away from her destination simply because the woman didn't know what kind of soil was there. Considering it was spring, there could be snow as well as knee-deep water. And that was a best-case scenario. Vivian climbed out of the car and turned on her flashlight. A good thing she had guessed to grab one, trying to remember the way to the abandoned school. Vivian tried to walk through the mud and snow. Good thing her shoes didn't get wet. Despite excelling in her studies, she always liked to have fun with her friends. She never lagged behind her girlfriends in relationships, also ran behind garages and came home after midnight tipsy. Really, it was once or twice, no more. Auntie was to blame. While the other girls sprayed themselves with tons of perfume and lit a whole pack to cover up the smell of cigarettes and alcohol, Vivian didn't have to do that. Aunt Eleanor didn't care about her. She was immersed in herself and her memoirs. Vivian wanted to listen to moralizing like the others, wanted to cover up odors and try to get out of the house after midnight, but she couldn't. Eleanor herself sometimes asked her why she didn't drink, invited her to her bohemian parties, and suggested her acquaintances as suitors. Because of this, Vivian often left the house or sat with her headphones on. At that time, she and her friends climbed all the abandoned houses in the neighborhood. Of course, the huge school building didn't go unnoticed. Memory did not fail Vivian. She identified exactly where the school was located. It was a huge, crumbling building that had once been the site of a factory, then a garment shop, and then abandoned. 10 years ago, the building had been considered a wreck, but now it seemed to be held together by nothing but good word of mouth. Vivian sighed and walked inside. She couldn't figure out what Damien wanted in this place or why he needed her. As she entered, she heard the annoying creaking of the wooden floor, which was like a sieve of mouse droppings. There was trash, cigarette butts and bottles lying everywhere. Vivian pulled out her cell phone and asked Damien where he was. In response, he shined the phone from somewhere above. "Where are you? Why did you drag me out of bed?" Vivian shouted. "Over here, Evans." Damien's voice sounded. "Damien." Vivian broke into a run, but the man's warning shout stopped her. Damien was hanging from a hole in the floor on the second floor. Apparently he had fallen through it. He somehow kept his balance and even managed to hold the phone. "The floor is very unreliable. You get there, you might fall through it yourself," Damien explained, shining the light on the floor. Vivian nodded. She was well aware of that too. "Why didn't you call 911? Figured since you got me in here, you'd have to get me out," Damien sighed indignantly. "The guys told me about the local homeless guy who lives at the school. They say he walks around, helps everyone, and they feed him for it. Yeah, they give him clothes. Are you sure it's him?" Vivian asked excitedly, and then she stopped. "Okay, I get it. We'll talk about it later. For now, we need to figure out how to get you out. Shouldn't we call the emergency services?" Damien didn't have time to answer. The plank beneath him began to make an ear-splitting creak and squeak. Sure, the height wasn't too great. He would probably survive the fall. But it wasn't just the height. The first floor was full of beams, metal objects and such. If he fell on them, no ambulance would help. Vivian gasped and rushed up the stairs. For a second, she was seized by memories she'd rather not remember. Of that very day, she hadn't heard Damien yell. She only heard the damn boards that creaked like a crunch in her body and generally made too many sounds that just kept the woman from concentrating. She realized that the emergency services wouldn't make it in time. Remembering her lessons on rescuing drowning people, Vivian spun on the floor as soon as she heard the creaking beneath her. She prayed to God that she wouldn't fall. An image of a daughter who might be alone came to mind, but then another, darker and gloomier one. Vivian crawled harder. Carefully, she pulled off her belt. Vivian tossed one end to Damien. He tossed his phone back to the ladder and picked up the end of the belt. Vivian grabbed some kind of beam with her other hand and started pulling. "I'm not going to follow you," Damien warned. "No, I'm not." Vivian parried and pulled again. Damien started to crawl out of the hole, but it was painfully slow, and the floor beneath them creaked harder and harder. The man seemed to be stuck, thanks to the thick jacket that kept him from falling. However, it didn't let him get out either. Vivian managed to pull Damien out of his trap, and she was sweating. Her arm ached. When the floor was beneath the man, he crawled slowly toward the flimsy staircase. Vivian went down to the first floor first and sighed in relief as she unbuttoned her jacket. "You're crazy," Damien said, leaning against the wall. "I remember when we caught a guy last year, and I had to do a lot more pirouettes than that." The woman grinned. A second after she said that, a beam fell a few centimeters from where Damien was. It fell through to the first floor and split in two with a clatter. Both Vivian and Damien stood wide-eyed. "About time," Damien said and exhaled. "It could have been me." The angry look the woman threw at the boy was unmatched. For a second, it seemed like Damien would have chosen to go back. "Why the hell did you call me instead of the emergency services? Have you had enough of life, you idiot? Are you out of your mind?" Vivian shouted, approaching the man. "You're an idiot and a moron." "Are you scared for me?" Damien asked, perplexed. Vivian stopped speaking and leaned against the icy stone wall, crying. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she held back as she always did. "I'm losing everyone," she said hoarsely. "And lately it seems to be my curse. I've lost my mother, my father, my husband. I didn't bury my mother in front of my children as a grown woman. When I was 13. I didn't understand what had happened or how this was possible. My father was out of my life even earlier, starting a series of these events. I was 10. I didn't even have time to memorize what he looked like. If it wasn't for the pictures, I wouldn't have known." Vivian continued in a shaky voice. "I buried my husband, not as a gray-haired old woman with trembling hands, but with a child in my arms, a 7-year-old girl who to this day doesn't understand why Daddy left her. And Daddy, at the last second of his life, called me. Not the emergency services, not the ambulance, but me. One traitorous tear rolled out of Vivian's eye, but she brushed it away so quickly Damien didn't notice. He'd been in an accident. The car flipped over, warped. It was impossible to get out from the inside. He realized that, so he called me and apologized. I was at work interviewing a witness. I was angry that he interrupted me. Then I got a voicemail from him. I wanted to open it, but I got a call from the ambulance. He was driving in the dark late at night, and he sent a video of him saying goodbye to his daughter. Vivian covered her face with her hands and breathed heavily. She couldn't understand why she was saying all this. Much less Damien, truth be told, he didn't care who to tell anymore. In the 8 months that Greg had been gone, Vivian had never, ever told anyone about her pain. That's why I was afraid for you. Because I won't suffer another death. Especially one that's my fault, she said in a muffled voice. Damien put his hand on Vivian's shoulder. I'm sorry, I really am. It was stupid of me to come here alone and call you. Vivian raised her eyes to the man and shook her head. I'm just glad you're alive. I'm glad it's all over. Wait. Vivian's discerning eye spotted movement in the darkness, as if someone was standing there eavesdropping. The woman snatched the flashlight from Damien's hands and shone it into the darkness. A short man with a beard and mustache, wearing an old hat, a tattered cotton jacket, and old boots, was looking at her. Vivian recognized him. It was exactly as Lillian had described him. Papa, she whispered. Vivian remembered little about her father. Vivian was short in stature, shorter than Laurel, and certainly shorter than Ellen. Her father had a tattoo on his forearm and a large scar behind his ear. Vivian didn't know where it came from, but she remembered her father telling more and more stories about its origins. At first, she believed it. Eventually, she realized she was being lied to. Now, an old man with gray hair and a sad, frightened look stood before Vivian, and she had absolutely no way of knowing if it was her father or not. She took a step forward, but Damien grabbed her arm. Father, what are you talking about? Vivian waved the man away and made her way toward the old man. With slow, cautious steps, she was afraid to startle him. Good evening. My name is Vivian. Your name? The old man smiled, revealing yellow teeth. My name's Stephen. Your father's name was Eugene, wasn't it? Damien asked with his usual sneer. Vivian rolled her eyes and chose not to answer. You don't recognize me. I realize it's been 19 years, but... 19? The old man interjected. That's the only years I remember. I didn't count, of course, but about 20 years ago I woke up in another city in the snow, remembering nothing. Stephen lowered his head and began to speak hoarsely, as if remembering something he very much disliked. Vivian listened attentively, trying to look at the unfamiliar features of his face. I lived there for a few years, and then I came to this lovely little town by chance. The people here were very kind. Not like the people where I woke up. They feed me, they give me water, they even give me clothes. And it's not a bad place to live. It's chilly in winter, of course, but I'm used to it. Shocked by the face and complete incomprehension, Vivian looked at the old man in front of her. She listened to him, and she felt scared, as if what he told her had happened to her personally. It was so horrible that she took a few slow steps back and leaned against the wall again. Damien touched her shoulder again and nodded, letting her know he was close by. So you don't remember anything that happened before you woke up in that city? Damien asked, giving Vivian time to pause. The old man shook his head. Do you have a tattoo of a ship on your forearm? Vivian asked. Stephen smiled as he looked at the girl and rolled up the sleeve of his wide jacket. There are dots right there. Ships. You know, I've always liked them. They're beautiful, you have to admit. Born to travel. We don't have the sea to get a glimpse of this splendor. The air stuck in Vivian's lungs and wouldn't come out. She looked helplessly at Damien and nodded. The man looked at the old man strangely. There was distrust and suspicion in his gaze. And the crescent-shaped scar behind his ear? Stephen shrugged his shoulders. I haven't had to look in a mirror in 20 years. Ma, I am, the old man said, nodding. Damien walked over to him and asked him to remove the hat behind his ear. There was indeed a large, thick scar that looked like a crescent moon. The man turned to Vivian and nodded. She couldn't hold back a sigh. Her knees trembled so hard it felt like the ground was about to go out from under her feet, and her hands couldn't grasp the phone in her pocket. Someone had texted. Right now, though, it didn't matter at all. Holding herself back, Vivian pulled out her phone, and from under the case pulled out an old, tattered photo of her father and mother. They were smiling happily together and looking at the camera. "Careful, Vivian." She held the photo out to Damien. He showed it to the old man with a flashlight. "Do you recognize it?" Stephen shrugged his shoulders as usual. The man, not so much. But the woman looks familiar, and she's beautiful. I think I've even dreamt about her sometimes. Yes, that's definitely her. I couldn't figure out where I'd seen her. She comes to me in my dreams, often talking nonsense. Well, that's not surprising. The cold makes you dream. That's my parents, Laurel and Yugi Swan. 19 years ago, my father went missing. He was short, with a tattoo of a ship on his forearm and a scar behind his ear. He made paper ships and gave them to children. "How did you give a ship to my daughter?" Vera asked. The old man listened to her in silence. Don't you dare say a word against it. There was a storm of emotions on his wrinkled face, from fear to hope. It seemed as if he were about to cry. "And what makes you think I am your father, madam?" he said at last. Yes, Vera answered distinctly. "Why didn't you say you were looking for your father?" Damien whispered almost in Faith's face. They talked Stephen or Eugene into having Damien come over to their house for the night and go to the hospital the next day. Admittedly, it wasn't an option Damien liked very much, his apartment having been turned into a sleepover. I wasn't sure. Vera shrugged and walked over to the sink to pour water. "I couldn't tell you that maybe my father was a bum who gave the kids paper boats. I thought I was crazy. Besides, it's not your place to tell me that. Is it okay to bring him to my house? First of all, you suggested it. Second of all, it's not okay to bring him to my house. I'd have Lily come over in the morning and find a homeless guy smelling like garbage on the couch." Damien nodded. "Okay, Vivian, I get it. I have a former neurologist who works at Central Hospital. I'll call her in the morning and see what I can do." "Yeah, well, call me and I'll try to get there early." There was a loud sigh. Damien rolled his eyes expressively. "Where are you going?" "At 2 in the morning. Stay. I've got a great bed. I also have a folding chair bed. Girl, you have clothes to sleep in, don't you?" Vivian nodded. She was very tired and didn't even try to refuse Damien's offer. In the few hours they had spent together, the hatred and bad memories had faded away. Maybe it was the fatigue that had caused it. Or maybe Vivian finally realized that they weren't children anymore. Despite their tiredness and even disconnectedness, neither Vivian nor Damien wanted to sleep. The man stripped the bed and spread out the couch. At first, Damien tried to walk quietly around his apartment, but then he realized that it was very difficult to wake Stephen. It wasn't surprising, though. Stephen slept in an abandoned building next door to alcoholics. They hardly behaved quietly at night. Vivian made tea for 2. A man came in and plumped tiredly in a chair. "So why a former doctor?" Vivian smiled and sipped her green tea. It should be clarified that Vivian liked to steer the topic away from herself. She hated being the center of attention. The reason for this was that she was afraid, being always in her aunt's house, to be an appendix to the apartment rather than a member of it. Vivian carried this behavior into later life as well. She hardly had any friends. Those couple of colleagues from work and former classmates remained in Kasimov, where the woman had lived for the last 10 years. She did not make acquaintances in the new city, and admittedly she didn't want to. For example, Vivian met Stacy by accident, having mixed up the doors of the apartment in the building where Lily and Vivian live. Not all the apartments have a number on them, because the house is newly built, and not even all the apartments have been sold yet. Those who have already settled in have put numbers on their doors. Vivian and Stacy, who had just moved in, didn't have time to do that. Late one night, after hanging out with a rude teenager who had been drinking, Vivian came home and got the wrong apartment door. She banged on Stacy's door for 20 minutes before she called the police. It took the police officer a long time to figure out what had happened. Damien grinned and shook his head. Vivian noticed that he was doing that a little too often lately. "Do you care about that?" Vivian shrugged and took another sip of her tea. It was hot and warmed her body. It was only now that she realized how tired and cold she was. "I was afraid," she said reluctantly. "We didn't see eye to eye." Vivian laughed. "It's not for me to know that it's almost impossible to get along with you." Damien smiled. "But that phrase is almost always an excuse. So what happened? Did I cheat?" "No, of course not," the man brushed it off. "She just wanted children. All her life she'd dreamed of a big wedding and a family. And I was 22. I'd just gotten back from the army, and admittedly, I wasn't planning to have kids for the next couple of years. Of course, we tried to live together, to stop quarreling, but in the end, she left." Dina smiled sadly. "I drank tea without sugar. Do you remember? It's nice." "It's hard to forget. I used to run to the kitchen and make you tea 5 times a day because you were lazy. Maybe I liked it when you looked after me." "No, you just liked picking on me," Vivian grinned, glancing at the wall. While Damien was gone, she had time to look around the apartment a bit and was basically surprised. Despite the outside clutter, it was clean. The one-bedroom apartment resembled the one Vivian had lived in with Ellen. A large room, a living room, and a small bedroom. The kitchen, surprisingly, was done in very nice modern colors with a tall table and a few paired chairs. It wasn't hard to realize that the man lived here alone, though. There was one skillet on the stove and one plate and fork in the sink. There was one cup on the countertop. Vivian had to work hard to find the other cup. "So what's your ex-girlfriend's name?" "I get it. You just don't want to talk about it, right?" "Okay, I played along. Her name was Abby, and she's a great name. The girl's a great neurologist and probably a good wife. She's also a mom, had a son a few years ago, and surprisingly, I became his godfather." "No way. I've always found it hard to maintain good relationships with exes. How would I know, though? My husband was my only partner, and he died. So tragic and pathetic. He died and I stayed." Vivian pitched forward and opened her eyes in surprise. "No way. She's 90 years old." 82 was celebrated at the beginning of the year, Damien replied. "She still tells stories about being in England in 1950. Vivian couldn't stop laughing. It felt like someone had jammed the on button. "I can't understand how you got into school," she said with a laugh. "I could never associate you with a teacher, except as a criminal." "Did you ever associate me with anyone?" Damien asked, smiling with the corners of his lips. The silence was more eloquent than any phrase. Vivian had never really seen Damien as a good person, never thought he'd become anything more than a bully. "There was a time when there was no work at all. My father was drinking himself to death, going crazy," Damien said, shifting the mug of tea from hand to hand. "There was nothing to live on. My neighbor worked at the school as a vice principal. She'd retroactively enrolled me in some kind of teacher training course and got me a job as an OBL teacher in September. Hotabike had just retired." "Hotabike? What did they call the old OBL teacher who wore a long beard and was bald?" Vivian asked. "Surprisingly, I liked it," Damien continued. "The pay wasn't great, but it was livable. I graduated as a history teacher, and now I have 2 jobs in classroom management." Vivian and Damien talked a little more about different things: work, family, and the past. They talked about the past only in passing, trying not to talk about how they felt about each other. For the first time in years, Vivian closed the gestalt of her resentment over what she thought was a spoiled childhood. "Thank you," the woman said as she and Damien went to bed. The man looked at her perplexed. "For keeping the conversation going and not letting me shut down," Vivian explained. Vivian leaned forward and opened her eyes in surprise. "For keeping me from thinking about what's going on with me and my father." "You're welcome," Damien replied simply and succinctly. "I've always done this. I'm not used to it." "What are you talking about?" Vivian asked, confused. "When we lived at Aunt Lily's house, it happened a lot. She'd say something to you, and you'd dwell on the words, the thoughts. I could see how you couldn't handle the flow of thoughts and delusions in your head. That's why you were talking nonsense. You were just trying to distract me from thinking." Damien shrugged. "Sometimes I just like to piss you off," he said, and retreated to the bedroom, where he went to sleep in a small and hardly comfortable chair, leaving Vivian alone with her thoughts. She couldn't believe it. She really had a fixation on what she was being told. Vivian spent long periods of time thinking about problems and their solutions, and knew about the problem, but she could never think that Damien noticed it. However, they had lived in the same room for several years. It would have been strange not to notice it. "We've got a lot of tests to do, of course, MRIs, blood work, and so on." Abby turned nervously to the door of room 8, where Stephen was lying. "Besides, it's important to get him out of the state he's in right now, since he doesn't have any identification. My hands are tied. If the story Damien told me is true, you should start recovering the documents immediately so we can start treatment." Abby was a petite blonde woman wearing square glasses with a round face and dimples on her cheeks. She smiled at everyone and was polite. She was also very excited about Damien's arrival. She seemed to really care about him. Only Vivian couldn't tell in what way she cared for him. "Thank you, Abby," Vivian said. "But if he hasn't had memories for 20 years, can they come back?" Abby put her head down into the clipboard. 20 years is a long time," she replied. "Patients usually recover quickly with supervision," Amy said. "But your father has signs of frostbite, signs of beating. He's also probably been drinking and smoking. Plus he was eating leftovers. That obviously didn't make things any better. Also, for memories to come back, you need familiar surroundings, familiar people. And he was living in an abandoned school, and hardly anyone was trying to help him. I can't say for sure, but the chances are slim to none. We'll do what we can, but I can't make any promises. Especially not until he has his papers." Vivian covered her face with her hand and shook her head. She didn't know what to do or how to be. The situation was getting worse and worse by the second. "Thank you, Abby." Damien smiled and walked away with Abby somewhere. When he returned, Vivian looked sadly at the room where her father lay. The orderlies had cleaned and dressed him. Vivian had brought new clothes. Now the woman was sure this old man was her father, short, with blue eyes, a scar and a tattoo. She had found him. Except he didn't remember anything. And that was terrible. Damien called out. "I've been thinking about the documents. We can't recover them yet." "With a stone in my heart," Vivian said. Her words were soaked with grief and heaviness. Dad had a business, apartments, money, and he'd disappeared too suddenly. And he was in a foreign city. Mom said he was away on a business trip. When he disappeared, he flew out. But he couldn't come back. And I think it's for a reason. He's clearly been helped to forget his life. If we recover the documents and his status, those involved might be very unhappy." Damien nodded and leaned against the cold wall, adjusting the white robe slung over his shoulders. 20 years have passed. Do you really think anyone still cares? I've been on the force for 7 years and, I've seen so much brutality. People are sometimes willing to remember things from decades ago, Vivian said. And if it's about money, they never forget. Yeah, I get it, Damien nodded. When you and I need to find out who's responsible for what happened as soon as possible. Otherwise, we won't be able to cure your father. Thank you for helping me and not going against my better judgment. You're welcome. Damien chuckled. I've never been against you. Immediately, a memory from 12 years ago came to his mind. What made you think you could yell at her? Damien had shouted in the face of Ellen, who was standing in the kitchen with a glass of wine, chewing slowly on an expensive cheese. Why do you think she is to blame for your troubles? She's been here longer than I expected. There's no point in living on my money. It's hard work, and she doesn't realize it, said Helene. Really? And what kind of labor do you do? Damien asked snidely, squinting his eyes. A third sentence a day, or maybe sleeping with another man. Why are you looking at me like that? I know about your lovers and the fact that you're cheating on my father. So, you should tell him, Ellen whispered. You can't? Maybe because your daddy's a drunk and he's about to be fired from his job. Oh, you won't even have a place to live. So don't cross me, puppy. You got it? From the hallway came the sound of the door opening. Ellen smiled and waved her hand at the floor, where a large purple mug with some writing on it had toppled over. No, Damien shouted. Oh, Damien, how could you break your favorite mug? Ellen asked, deliberately loud. Vivian flew into the kitchen and saw the purple shards with the boy standing next to it. How dare you? Crooked. Hands, you moron, she shouted. Damien sighed and gave Ellen a long look. These were his last days in this apartment, because soon this woman would kick both him and his father out. Damien knew that, but even more so, he realized that he couldn't do anything to change his mind, or he'd be on the streets for sure. He was sitting in his house when Vivian called and asked him to come over. Luckily, he had a sick day. After hearing about Vivian's problems, he realized he would have to take a mini vacation. Abby was happy to help open up the sick leave. To briefly talk about Damien, we can say that he is quite a kind person. Yes, in high school, and even in college, he was never known for being overly disciplined and submissive. And without hiding the truth, in the army too, not once fell for the rudeness of his superiors. However, with time it passed, and he began to take everything easier. He never refused to help anyone, but at the same time he was not particularly appreciated in the teaching staff. He often ridiculed other teachers, taking the side of students, realizing perfectly well that he had once been the same. Of course, no one could fire him. He did not break any rules, but good relations could not be built. The once popular boy turned into a man who rarely left the house. Most of his friends had left for other cities, and those that remained had families. Damien rarely went out for vacations, devoting most of his time to work. Vivian was a ray of light in his dull and ordinary life. He even enjoyed going to abandoned houses and trying to find Vivian's father. Damien got in his car and drove to the address. He didn't know what Vivian had in mind there, but he didn't care. Talking to her gave him pleasure. He was no longer thinking about how to make it through the weekend. His head was filled with other thoughts. The door to the Johnsons' apartment was open. "Damien, you come in," shouted a woman's voice from the far room. The man made his way there and saw a large desk piled with folders, with a laptop standing next to it, covered in pictures. "What kind of archive file is this?" Damien grinned and threw his backpack on the couch. "I had an acquaintance from the American Home Office send over all the documents from my father's missing persons case," the woman said. "And how did he send them so quickly?" "That you traveled overnight to Denver to get them," Damien wondered. "Vivian, you're a weirdo," she waved him off and walked over to the stack of folders. "Let's go look at everything." "Are you going to help or don't you think?" Damien asked, approaching the desk. "I need to find the culprit, or my father won't be able to go back to normal. Let's figure this out. You can take care of the laptop. There's a file on there with all of Dad's biography, his phone records, and his possessions. An acquaintance did a good job, though. He and I worked in Denver before he moved. He just happens to have access to the database, so he's helped me out a lot. Come on, the sooner we get started, the sooner we'll be done. Oh, by the way, Lily's gonna be here soon. We need to figure out what to tell her." A few hours later, the front door slammed and Lily came running into the room. She was happy and cheerful, clearly wanting to tell her mother something. When she saw the strange man, however, she was embarrassed. "Hello," the girl said quietly. Damien smiled and waved. Vivian took her daughter into the kitchen. She was gone for a long time, so the man decided not to waste any time. He continued flipping through the files. His gaze stopped on the largest and most labeled author's file. The man opened it and began to read slowly and thoughtfully. With each line, he was surprised more and more. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair and sighed. Vivian came back in and quietly closed the door. "She's really tired. She's already gone to bed. Good thing tomorrow is a day off. No homework to do." "Where has she been?" "Late at a friend's house." "Did you find something?" "What do you know about your father's business?" Vivian shrugged. "I was 10, didn't have much interest in it then, and when I did, there was no one to ask." I also knew why my mother and I didn't get the business. Yeah, they weren't married, so my mom's last name was Swan. We also didn't get Grandma's 4-bedroom apartment. Not for that reason. There's another, Damien said seriously. Listen carefully. When your father's firm opened, there was a stipulation that shares could not be inherited through bloodlines. That is, when one of the partners dies or withdraws, all the shares go to the remaining partners in the firm. Is that legal? Vivian wondered. Yes, but it's rare. I suspect your father didn't think much about family when he started the firm. He and Mom got together later. But that's not all. Do you know how many partners there were? Vivian shook her head and climbed onto the couch with her feet up. 4. Your father, Matthew, Johnson, and Smith. Do you know how many are left now? 1. Johnson. Do you think? Wait. 3 years before your father went missing, Matthew died. Heart attack. 41 years old. That early. That's not the only thing that's strange. The thing is, the will he left behind said his shares were to be inherited by your father. But that's impossible. He had no right under domestic law to transfer the shares to outsiders. But he transferred them to a partner. And your father got a controlling interest and the ability to run the firm almost on his own. But why did Matthew do that? Damien wondered. Matthew, the 3 M's. That's them on the boat my father made for Lily. There was a sign that's on my boat too. The 3 M's. Matthew. I don't remember much about my father, but I do know that my father fell in love with the sea when he met his friend. And everything in the house connected to the sea was connected to this friend. I couldn't remember his name, but I think it was Matthew. So he left a will to his father. Perhaps he knew or felt something. But that's not all. Damien continued. 5 years later, after your father went missing, Smith died of an accident. 5 years is the time frame after which a person is declared dead, Vivian said thoughtfully. Which means that, by law, the firm passes to the remaining partners, and Johnson, to get the full package, gets rid of the other partner. And remains the sole bannels of the firm, Vivian whispered. So you think my father was eliminated to get the inheritance? Yes, Damien nodded. I suspect that Johnson and Smith conspired to get 50% of the firm's shares that your father had. How did it go unnoticed? Didn't it become suspicious to anyone? They must have been quite cleverly planned, said Vivian, confused. Money is everything. You know who can live and who can't. The only thing that confuses me is the fact that your father is alive, Damien said thoughtfully. Matthew and Smith are dead, but your father isn't. And here it's simple. I think those who wanted to get rid of my father just hid him and dumped him somewhere. I don't know. He survived, and lucky for them, he lost his memory. It's scary to realize that, Damien admitted. But let's take our minds off it for a moment. Do you have coffee? Vivian nodded and got up from the couch. Her gaze was slightly detached. She wasn't looking around, her eyes were fixed on one point. Are you okay? Damien asked gently. So is there coffee? A few minutes later, Vivian was already standing at the stove, making coffee. You're not busy tomorrow? Will you sit with Lillian? I'm going to Casimov to see Johnson. I want to ask him something. Damien, who was sitting at the table, jumped up and in 2 steps was next to Vivian. Are you out of your mind? We just assumed he was responsible for 2 people being dead, 1 20 years without memory, and you decide to go straight to him and declare that you know he's a criminal. Don't scream, Vivian said tiredly, and lowered her gaze to Damien's hands that held her shoulders. She could feel his warmth and strong grip. Let me go, or the coffee will be on the floor in a few seconds. Damien slowly let go of her, looking down at his hands. He ah-hed, as if waking up. Apparently he had done it unknowingly. Are you worried? Vivian asked, not demanding an answer. I've worked with such personalities, so you don't have to worry about my safety. Vivian looked at Damien with disbelief. I'll go with you, the man said firmly, his confident gaze fixed directly on Vivian. No arguments. Yeah, I get why you're so involved in my problems, Vivian asked as they sat down at the table and started drinking coffee. Damien was taken aback and looked at the woman incomprehensively. But when I met you, the negative emotions that I experienced as a child flared up in my soul. It's childish, I know. Well, haven't you ever had that? A quiet chuckle escaped Damien's lips, and he shook his head. No. Maybe it's because I've never felt negative about you. How could you? You were always playing tricks on me. Vivian exclaimed. Yes, you said you talked nonsense when you didn't want me to dwell on my thoughts. But that wasn't always the case. You broke the mug my friends gave me, broke my headphones, made fun of me at school, and even told off the guys I dated. You ruined my life, Vivian said slowly, trying to control her sudden emotions. Remember the new headphones for my birthday? Yes, it was the only present from Aunt Ellen in all the years. Why are you looking at me like that? No, wasn't that her present? Damien grinned. He squinted at the woman, trying to figure out how someone so smart and savvy could be so naive. The boys and I used to work part-time during the summer. I used the money to buy them. I didn't have enough to buy them, but I had to borrow some from my father. It was his stash in case of a hangover. I had a hell of a time. Vivian looked at the man confused. She gently took his hand and tilted her head. Why? You needed them so you wouldn't listen to me. I saw how worried you were about them. I thought you hated me. Did you? Did you? I liked Vivian, and I was a stupid boy who liked her that way. Do you understand? It's a corny story, you say. Vivian stared blankly in front of her. In an instant, her world had been turned upside down. She felt that something was wrong, but she could never figure out what it was. Coping with her emotions, the woman jumped up from the table and announced, "It's decided. Tomorrow we go to Kasimov." Vivian, my dear, is it really you? You were about 13 when I last saw you, asked Daniel Forrester, an older man in an expensive suit. He jumped up from his chair as soon as he realized who had come to see him. Damien and Vivian eyed the man warily. It was unclear why he was so hospitable to them. He took them to a local cafe and ordered several not cheap meals himself. Don't worry, I'm paying. After all, this firm was built by your father with labor and sweat, he said. It's a shame you couldn't find him. It was you who paid for 8 years to find him. Damien asked. Vivian looked at him shocked. Yes, I had hoped to find something, Daniel nodded. But it's like he's gone to ground. All your partners have disappeared, don't you think? I recognize my father's grip. Daniel grinned and smiled sadly. Yes, it was like that. I honestly could never believe it was an accident. First Mike, then Eugene, and then Ben, one after another. I spent the next 6 years taking the trash out with security. I was afraid I'd suffer the same fate. Weren't you the one who set that fate up? Vivian asked me snidely. No, I didn't have to. Ben's death, at least. After your father went missing, the controlling interest went to me, not Ben. Well, I mean, he split it between us, but I had 51%. That's better. Young man, I don't suppose you've ever run a big firm on your own. Believe me, it's not that easy. I was going to give some of my shares to Ben to take over. And Ben knew that. As a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience, I did the word processing as follows. And several other lawyers drafted the contract. And then Ben died in an accident. And there was definitely an accident. 2 other workers died on that construction site, safety violations. The site was just shut down. It's all in Ben's file. So I had nothing to do with it. Daniel Forrester smiled sadly and sipped from his glass of water. Besides, I definitely had nothing to do with Eugene's disappearance. I had no idea when or what time he was going home. Only Ben knew his flight time. Vivian looked at Damien with confusion. If Daniel Forrester was to be believed, their version was crumbling before their eyes. And Ben. How had he behaved in the years since Eugene Stepanovich had disappeared? Damien asked carefully. He was always calling someone and nervous. I was sure he'd just taken a mistress. You could hear in his voice that he was calling a woman. That's quite normal. For him, he was always very nervous and restless. They say that's why he died. You have to stay calm on a construction site. Vivian and Damien asked Daniel Forrester a few more questions and left. Already in the car, they looked at each other confusedly. Do you think it's not him? Vivian asked. Not only did he spend 8 years paying for the search, but he also erected a huge monument to your father. I read in the files he was actually going to give 10% of the shares to Kartashov, which would have made him the leader. I don't think he just changed his mind and took him out. And he couldn't have been involved in Mike's death because he was in Israel for over 6 months. How do you know all this? Vivian snatched the laptop out of Damien's hands and took a deep breath. Who gave you permission? You didn't think I'd let you go talk to an alleged criminal. Vivian turned away from Damien and muttered something quietly to herself. But Damien could see the edge of a smile on the woman's face. I can't get over the fact that Kartashov kept calling someone. I wish I knew who it was. 20 years ago, not everyone had a cell phone, and most people called from landlines. So the lady's number could have been saved somewhere. If Kartashov's things were still there, Damien concluded. Vivian grinned and started the car. I read something too. I can't believe you got into the house, Damien whispered and sneezed. Vivian drove them to the house where Kartashov had once lived. Because he had no one, the house was left empty and became just another abandoned building. In fact, no one lives here. So I don't see anything wrong with it, she said. Did you use a tire iron to knock the boards off the windows and get in? Damien objected. Oh, it's nothing. We'll write it off to the teenagers. Vivian shrugged and walked on, shining her flashlight on the way. Here, Damien shouted. Vivian walked over and saw the phone with the phone book next to it. How will we know which number we need? The woman shrugged and opened the dusty old book. Damien and Vivian gasped at the dust that rose. It's been so many years. After all, the book flipped through very quickly, pages skipping, until Vivian saw a number written in red pen. Judging by the spread of the book, it was the page that had been opened the most. The number had been circled several times in pencil. It's not signed, Damien said. It doesn't need to be, Vivian said sadly. I know it by heart. They walked outside in a terrible mood, not knowing how to react to the news. Damien looked straight into Vivian's eyes. He stepped closer to her and kissed her. Vivian was taken aback. What are you doing? You just got into the house, found the culprit. Well, almost. And probably helped your father. You're awesome. You know that? You're not what I thought you were either, Vivian admitted and blushed. Here's how I edited the continuation of the text according to your instructions. This is the first time in your life you've ever admitted you were wrong, Damien grinned, and Vivian punched him in the shoulder painfully. You can't make me change my mind. Vivian smiled imperceptibly. Ellen Swan, is that you? A tall man in black clothing asked, holding out his ID card in front of him. Did you know Ben Kartashov? No, the woman replied hysterically as she was questioned at the police station. Your phone number was found in his address book. There are also witnesses who saw you together. So what? He was my lover, Ellen held her head high. And the mastermind behind the attack on your brother. He was the only one who knew when he was going home. Eugene was attacked near the train station. An attack? Ellen shouted. Are you out of your mind? Why would I harm my own brother? Your mother's 4-room apartment, answered the investigator clearly and succinctly. You were up to your neck in debt that year. You had loans. And I suspect not only the banks owed. And immediately after receiving the inheritance, 6 months later you put the apartment for sale, and it was very quickly bought, which suggests that a buyer was found early. You paid off the debt, got rid of your brother, whose considerable bank account went to you and his daughter. And since she was young, her mother put her money aside. And when Laurel died, you got the rest. That's where you got the money for the social gatherings. Ellen Swan, isn't it? The investigator asked sneeringly. Your niece has provided all the evidence that will help me put you away for a long time, as well as solve a case from 20 years ago. So you can go ahead and get a lawyer. Ellen, you're definitely going to need one. The investigator was an old friend of Vivian's. She heard the whole conversation thanks to the recording phone. They listened to the tapes with Damien. The man held Vivian's hand. Did you win? He smiled. "We did," Vivian corrected and squeezed Damien's hand tighter. 3 years later, a large truck labeled transportation stopped in front of the 3-story house. 2 uniformed men got out of the truck and headed toward the house, keys in hand. An older car was parked next to the truck, from which a blonde-haired man with a large bag on his shoulder got out. He surveyed the area and opened the back door. A tall girl of about 11 years old climbed out. She was smiling cheerfully and looking around, hoping to spot something interesting. She was holding a large paper boat. A short, bald old man with a beard got out of the passenger seat. "Loaders," he shouted. "Where's Vivian?" "She should have gotten here before us," Damien replied in a warm voice to the old man, Yugi. Damien shrugged and pulled out his phone to dial Vivian's number. "Probably socializing with criminals again." "It's such nice weather and she's at work again," the old man complained. "Nature around here is so beautiful. May had blossomed, the smell of lilacs was everywhere. And the sun was shining so brightly that it seemed as if summer had already arrived. The trees were covered with little leaves. Birds sang on all sides, and the pond behind the house glistened in the sun. It really was grace. Not just nice weather, but Vivian was at work again. She had been spending too much time there lately, Damien thought. "Uncle Damien, look." Lillian shouted and pointed to the road, where a police car with flashing lights was coming at almost full speed. 100 meters from the 3-story building, she turned off the siren and began to slow down. The police car stopped in front of Damien. Vivian jumped out of the back seat and waved to the driver and his partner. "Thanks, guys. I owe you one. Good luck," she said. Vivian turned around to her family and was met with shocked looks. "What about you guys?" "Actually, they took my car, so I had to improvise," Vivian said. "Where have you been? Were you going to miss the housewarming party?" Damien asked. Vivian rolled her eyes and walked toward the house. She was in a great mood, and not even her lover's nagging would ruin this wonderful day. For the first time in years, Vivian felt at home in this unfinished building where new furniture had just been brought in. But this place was truly her own. Her whole family would be gathered under one roof, and for the first time in a long time, the woman felt happy. "By the way, you were supposed to be at work," Vivian said snidely, showing the movers where to carry the big couch. "It was your 10th grade class that had a concert in Italy near the principal's house. You got a call, but you didn't answer." "I don't take work numbers on weekends," Damien mumbled, wondering what kind of reprimand he'd get on Monday when he got back to his favorite 10th grade class. The head teacher had told him not to take those slackers. But could he refuse them? It was almost impossible. Oh, he'd probably lose his bonus. But what did he have to do with it? It's the end of the year. The boys are having their last free year. Why touch them? Damien froze. Vivian snapped her fingers in front of his face. She chuckled and walked into the house. These blackouts often happen when the man was thinking about something, especially in the last year. Lillian ran into the house first and immediately rushed to the 2nd floor, where she chose the largest and most beautiful room. True, there was nothing special in it yet, but Yuji's grandfather already had a plan to please his granddaughter. Yugi hadn't regained all of his memory, but some of it had definitely returned. He couldn't testify in court against his sister Laurel because the doctors wouldn't give him permission. However, the prosecutor still referred to his memories. However, without his help, Laurel was sentenced to 11 years in a penal colony, and all the money and the apartment returned to the owner. It must be admitted, Abi turned out to be a good doctor. The first successes in treating Yuji appeared in a couple of months, and in 6 months he already remembered his daughter. A year later, Yuji remembered almost all the events of the last 30 years of his life. However, it was very difficult to fully recover his memory. Vivian could not get her father to remember how he met her mother. Yes, and much that was before the birth of his daughter he did not remember. However, that didn't make him any less loved. Lily got used to her grandfather almost immediately. She spent a lot of time with him and often asked for help. Yugi taught his granddaughter how to make paper boats and was very happy to have a family again. He smiled sadly as he remembered the years he had spent on the streets. Damien had also made friends with his father-in-law. Though it had to be admitted, he couldn't get used to him for a long time. His quiet and arrogant demeanor kept Eugene from trusting his son-in-law. Vivian was walking up the stairs to the top of the stairs. She took Damien under her arm and pulled him to the third floor. There was the largest room with a huge window and a small terrace. Vivian and Damien had chosen this place for themselves together. The woman wanted a place to relax on the terrace with flowers, and Damien dreamed of sitting there and reading books. However, their desires did not contradict each other. As soon as the door leading to the stairs slammed shut, Vivian spun in place and started laughing loudly. Damien looked at her with a smile. "Have you decided to go crazy?" he asked. "I guess so. It's just, I feel like this is the first white streak in my life. Like there's never been one before." "A lifetime-long black streak," Vivian replied. Damien slowly walked over to her and hugged her. "May the white streak be as long as the black streak," he said. Vivian reached into her bag and pulled out a framed, yellowed ship. "This is where the symbol of our happy life will hang in this room," she said.